conducting a review on the operation of the scheme that will report before August this year. The review's underway, and I very much hope that it will address all the matters, so those that actually do qualify for these payments get them in a much more expedited way.
Spokesperson Richard Thompson.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Now, given the length of time it takes in many cases to gather the supporting evidence to make a claim under the scheme, given the pressures on the Payments Board itself and the very strong likelihood that many of those who are potentially eligible have yet to apply, it's clear that there's a risk that many of those who could be eligible for a payment may miss out as things stand. So one of the ways that the Minister, the Secretary of State, could mitigate against that is to extend the period that is allowed for claims to be made and processed. As part of this review, will he consider extending that deadline?
Yes, it is actually part of the review. It's one of the questions we're looking at.
Simon Baines.
Question number 6, please, Mr Speaker.
Thursday.
I wish to reassure I thank my honourable friend for his question. I wish to reassure him that the UK government is fully committed to protecting and upholding Northern Ireland's place in the Union. I regularly discuss matters of Union and the importance of Northern Ireland within it and with Cabinet colleagues, and meet frequently with the Secretary of State for Wales and Scotland.
Simon Baines.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Would my right honourable friend agree that the Union is now stronger than ever, particularly with the decline of the SNP, and that its vital importance can be seen not only in Northern Ireland, but also in border constituencies like mine of Clwyd South, particularly in shared services across the border with neighbouring North Shropshire, such as the Gabowen to Wrexham line, the A5A483 and the Chirk St Martin's GP partnership.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As you can see, all politics is local, and I congratulate my honourable friend in the success of shared cross-border services in his constituency, and he's absolutely right. I know he's a great champion of connectivity across the United Kingdom, and I'm sure his constituents appreciate his efforts on these matters.
Sammy Wilson.
Speaker, every devious, deceitful and dishonest tactic is being used to try and bribe, bully and beat unionists into accepting the Windsor Framework and the Northern Ireland Protocol, despite the impact it has on our citizenship and on the Union. It seems that the latest recruit is the Chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee, who only this week has told BBC that unions should get back into Stormont because constitutional issues are the responsibility of the EU, and that the Irish government in any settlement would have a say in the future of Northern Ireland. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this Conservative Unionist government has not handed constitutional control of Northern Ireland to the EU, and that the Chairman of the Northern Ireland Affairs Committee has either become an overzealous advocate of the scare tactics or is talking through his hat?
Senior is brief as ever, Secretary of State.
Well, based on that, Chair, the Select Committee Chair has a lot of work to do to increase his popularity in this House. I think, as ever, the honourable gentleman asks a question in his characteristic shrinking violet way, and I have to say I completely disagree with what he says about my right honourable friend. But we need to get a deal done now. The people of Northern Ireland want to get a deal done. It is time for a deal to be done. Let's get the executive back up and running.
Before we come to Prime Minister's questions, I'm pleased to inform the House that since last week we've been providing British Sign Language coverage on all question statements as a matter of course. This is available directly on parliamentlive.tv and is also available to broadcasters, media outlets who may be interested in taking up the live feed. I'm delighted that House Service has been able to deliver this significant improvement to accessibility of our proceedings. We now start with questions. Prime Minister Jason McCartney.
Question 1, please, Mr Speaker.
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others in addition to my duties in this House. I shall have further such meetings later today.
Jason McCartney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. According to the Alzheimer's Society, nearly 5,000 people are currently living with dementia in my Colne Valley constituency, of whom 3,153 have had a formal diagnosis. That figure went up by 1 this week with my dad's diagnosis. My dad is my constituent. Will my right honourable friend pledge to make dementia a priority by driving up diagnosis rates, bolstering dementia research, investing in social care and improving access to the most innovative diagnostic methods and improving access to new life-changing treatments?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I send my warmest wishes to my honourable friend and his father and family, and I recognise that a dementia diagnosis can bring worry, both for the person who is diagnosed, but also their wider family. And my honourable friend is absolutely right about the timely diagnosis of dementia. It's vital to make sure that those affected can access the care and support they need. NHS England is actually carrying out a pilot to make sure that we can improve dementia diagnosis in care homes. Our major condition strategy also includes a focus on dementia, but crucially, as my honourable friend said, we are now doubling the funding for dementia research so we can help everyone, including his father.
We now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Keir Starmer.
Can I send my best wishes to the honourable member and his father also, and all those suffering in this way? Mr Speaker, I can't let today pass without saying how saddened I was by the tragic death of Bronson Battersby, aged just 2, who died in heartbreaking circumstances in Skegness. I know that this House will join me in sending our deepest sympathies to his family. Mr Speaker, the government has been forced to admit that it has lost contact with 85% of the 5,000 people earmarked for removal to Rwanda. Has he found them yet?
Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, what I can tell the honourable gentleman is that in spite of him blocking every single attempt that we have taken, we have managed now, because of our actions, to reduce the number of people coming here by over 1/3 last year, remove over 20,000 people from this country back to their home countries, carried out 70% more illegal enforcement raids, arrested hundreds of people, closed down thousands of bank accounts, and processed over 100,000 cases, the biggest number in over 20 years, Mr Speaker. That's because on this side of the House, we want to stop the boats, we have a plan, it's working, and with him we would just go back to square one.
My first thought is, how do you actually lose 4,250 people? Then you remember that this is the government that scrapped HS2, but the costs are still rising by billions. This is the government that spent £400 million of taxpayers' money on a Rwanda scheme, yet can't deport a single person. And this is the government that waged a week-long war on the Greek Prime Minister for reasons known only to themselves. And suddenly you're reminded that, of course, this farce of a government could lose the people it was planning to remove. But he didn't answer the question, so I'll ask him again. Where are the 4,250 people that the government has lost? Where are they?
Mr Speaker, as I said, we've actually identified and removed over 20,000 people from this country back to where they belong. But he asks these questions about the Rwanda scheme, Mr Speaker. Now, it is important that we get this up and running, because it's important, as the National Crime Agency say, that we have a working deterrence to resolve this issue. That's indeed how Australia solved this problem, and that's how Albania has worked for us. But we know he asked these questions, Mr Speaker, about the detail of these things, but we all know he doesn't actually care about solving this problem, and we know this because when the BBC asked him about the Rwanda plan, they quizzed him and they said, if the numbers crossing the channel on small boats decline, i.e. so it's working, would you still reverse it? The Labour leader said yes. It's crystal clear he doesn't have a plan, and it will be back to square one,
Mr Speaker, spending £400 million on a plan not to get anybody to Rwanda whilst losing 4,000 people is not a plan. It's a farce. Only this government could waste hundreds of millions of pounds on a removals policy that doesn't remove anyone. Only this government could claim that it's going to get flights off the ground only to discover they couldn't find a plane. Only this government could sign a removal deal with Rwanda only to end up taking people from Rwanda to here. But he still hasn't answered the question. So I'll try again. What progress has he made in locating the 4,250 people his government has apparently lost? He's dodged it 3 times. Where are they?
Mr. Speaker, it's the same thing again and again. Here we are talking about what we are doing, but I'm happy to go over it, Mr. Speaker. What are we doing? We've increased the number of illegal enforcement raids by 70%, leading to thousands of arrests, using powers, Mr. Speaker, that he blocked in this House. We have closed down thousands of bank accounts of illegal workers, again, using powers that he blocked, Mr. Speaker.
Order. Mr. Do you want that early cup of tea, or are you going to be a little bit more silent, Prime Minister?
And, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we have worked through a record number of cases and returned a record number of people back to where they've come. All of that is a plan that is working, and we can see that it's working because the numbers of people coming to this country are down by over a third, Mr. Speaker. But again, it is a bit rich to hear him in here pretending that he cares about how we actually stop the boats when he's been crystal clear. He's been crystal clear and said that even if the plan is working to reduce the numbers, he would still scrap it, Mr. Speaker. It's because he has no values, no conviction and no plan. It is back to square one.
No. Yes.
He hasn't got a clue where they are, has he? I can tell you one place they aren't, and that's Rwanda. Because the only people who sent to Rwanda is cabinet ministers. And for all the word, the ridiculous thing is, we know the Prime Minister himself doesn't even believe in this Rwanda gimmick. He had to be talked out of scrapping the whole thing. He didn't want to fund it. He didn't think it would work. When he sees his party tearing itself apart, hundreds of bald men scrapping over a single broken comb, doesn't he wish he'd had the courage to stick to his guns?
Well, Mr. Speaker, now, I have absolute conviction that the plan we've put in place will work. Absolute conviction, because I believe it's important that we grip this problem. Now, he spends a lot of his time in this House talking about his time as a lawyer, Mr. Speaker, and I would urge him to listen to them, because Lord Wolfson has said that our bill severely limits the... 4 eminent KCs have said that it is undoubtedly the most robust piece of immigration legislation this Parliament has seen, and Mr. Speaker, a former Supreme Court...
I want to hear what the Prime Minister's got to say, because it matters to my constituents, those who feel it doesn't matter to those. Please leave, Prime Minister.
As I said, Mr. Speaker, 4 eminent KCs said this is undoubtedly the most robust legislation passed, and a former Supreme Court Justice has been clear that the bill would work. But I know, Mr. Speaker, he's always been more interested in what lefty lawyers have to say, Mr. Speaker. I've even got here the textbook that he authored for them. And it's called, and I quote, European Human Rights Law by Keir Starmer. So...
Prime Minister! Prime Minister, when I stand up, please sit down. Can I just say, we don't use props in this House, and I will certainly ensure that if you do need reminding, I certainly will. Keir Starmer.
It's such utterly pathetic nonsense. He's been brutally exposed by his own MPs yet again. He's got one party chair who says she hopes the Lords will rip his Rwanda deal to pieces. He's got 2 more who had to quit because they don't think it'll work. All of them appointed by him, all now in open revolt against his policy, each other, and reality. Is there any wonder they all think this gimmick is doomed to failure when the Prime Minister himself doesn't believe in it?
Mr. Speaker, it is rich to hear from the honourable gentleman about belief in something, because it will be news to him. It is actually the case that you can believe in something and stick to that position on this side of the House.
I will say to this side. Oh, hello. Somebody's jumping in from over. Can I just say it's very important. It's an important day. People want to know what's going on. So I want my constituents, just like yours, to hear what the Prime Minister's got to say. Prime Minister.
Just this week, Mr. Speaker, we had another example of the honourable gentleman doing one thing, saying another, because this week he backed the Home Secretary in banning the terrorist group Hizb ut-Tahrir, despite him personally using the European Court of Human Rights to try and stop them being banned. And don't take my word for it, Mr. Speaker, the extremist's own press release said, and I quote, "the Hizb ut-Tahrir legal team led by Keir Starmer." Now, I know he doesn't like talking about them because they've been a client, but when I see a group chanting jihad on our streets, I ban them, he invoices them.
Because there's 8 questions that I think some of you may want. Well, I'll tell you what, there's some's already gone off the list who wanted them. Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, if he stuck to his position, he'd be voting with us. He'd be voting with us. His former Home Secretary says the plan won't work. His current Home Secretary calls it batshit. His former Immigration Minister doesn't back his plan. Even the Prime Minister himself doesn't believe in it. And last week, another of his MPs said the Tories should admit that things have got worse since they came to office, that after 14 years they've left Britain less united, the country is a sadder place. If the Prime Minister can't even persuade his own MPs that it's worth supporting him, if he himself doesn't even believe in his own policies, why on earth should anyone else think differently?
Mr. Speaker, another week when it's crystal clear the honourable gentleman doesn't believe in anything and he doesn't have a plan. Now, while he talks the country down, let me update him on what's actually been happening in the past week. Inflation more than halved from 11% to 4%. Real wages rising. Real wages rising for the 5th month in a row. Last week, rates started falling and millions of people benefited from a tax cut worth £450. So while he takes us back to square one with a £28 billion tax grab, let's stick with a plan that's delivering a brighter future for Britain.
Mr. Speaker, it's against the law to silence victims of crime, but that's exactly what the Post Office did through the use of non-disclosure agreements. And this is just the most recent case of NDAs covering up mismanagement, misconduct and even crimes at work. Will my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, consider banning their use in all severance agreements once and for all?
Minister.
My right honourable friend is right to raise an important point, and the ability to speak out about things is key to unlocking justice. And while NDAs can have a place, my honourable friend is right to say that they shouldn't be used to stop victims of crime, in particular, getting the justice that they deserve. I can tell her that the Ministry of Justice are carefully considering how to best address this issue, including legislation, and I know that my right honourable friend, the Justice Secretary, will keep the House updated on further progress.
Leader of the SNP, Stephen Flynn.
Mr. Speaker, when people woke up today in homes that they can't afford to heat with mortgages that they're struggling to pay, to news that inflation is once again on the rise, they'll have looked to Westminster for answers. And instead they find a UK government which is tearing itself apart over how quickly it can send vulnerable people on a plane to Rwanda. Surely the Prime Minister must understand that the anger that some of his own backbenchers have towards him is no comparison to the anger that the public have towards his party.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, if the honourable gentleman did care about supporting working families to pay their bills, to pay their mortgage, why on earth is the SNP making Scotland the highest tax part of the United Kingdom, where the average, Mr. Speaker, not the wealthiest, where the average worker in Scotland is now paying more tax than they do in England?
Stephen Flynn.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, when it comes to the Rwanda Bill, the reality is that if you want to stop the smuggling gangs, you should introduce safe and legal routes. But instead, the Prime Minister is seeking to weaponise some of the most vulnerable people in society. It is straight out of the cruel and callous right-wing extremist playgroup. His time in office is fast approaching its conclusion. Does he seriously want this to be his legacy?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, it is important that we stop the boats because illegal migration is simply not fair, Mr. Speaker. It's not right that some people jump the queue, that they take away our resources to help those who are the most compassionate, that need our most help, and, by the way, Mr. Speaker, are exploited by gangs, and many of them lose their lives making these dangerous crossings. So I completely disagree with the honourable gentleman. The fair and the compassionate thing to do is to break these criminal gangs, and that's why we're going to stop the boats.
Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Unexpectedly, 5 months ago, I had a heart attack. And thanks to the swift action of the NHS emergency services, it was caught early. So one stent operation later, I was on a swift path to rehabilitation and recovery and stand here today fighting fit and a bit lighter too. So along with encouraging everyone to visit the British Heart Foundation website to understand the early warning signs and get fantastic resources to help them, would the Prime Minister also join me in personally thanking everyone who helped to save my life and help me recover, including the East of England Ambulance Service, the teams at Watford General and Harefield Hospital, the cardiac rehabilitation teams, and everyone who supported me, especially my family and my team, some of whom are in the gallery today, who helped ensure that I continue to deliver for the great people of Watford.
I thank my honourable friend for sharing his story, and I know the whole House will be delighted to hear that he's made a swift recovery. We all wish him good health for the future as he resumes his excellent campaigning on behalf of his constituents in Watford. And I also join him in thanking our fantastic NHS staff for the life-saving work that they do up and down the country. We're backing them with record resources, from our doctors to our ambulance service. We are all in this House truly grateful for what they do.
Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Until the UK government calls for an immediate ceasefire, it is complicit in the horrors in Gaza. Not my words, but those of the head of Oxfam, who, like every single agency trying to operate on the ground, is clear that aid can't be effectively delivered while fighting continues. More UK aid is, of course, welcome, but even when it does get through, it can result in what one Palestinian aid worker calls bombing us on full stomachs. 24,000 people have already been killed. So can he tell us what will it take for him to back a permanent bilateral ceasefire?
Mr. Speaker, of course, we want to see a peaceful resolution to this conflict as soon as possible. A sustainable, permanent ceasefire with an end to the destruction, fighting and loss of life, release of hostages and no resumption of hostilities would, of course, be the best way forward. But in order to achieve that, a number of things need to happen. Hamas would have to agree to release all the hostages. Hamas would no longer have to be in charge of Gaza, and the threat of more rocket attacks from Hamas into Israel would have to end. And the Palestinian Authority, boosted with assistance, would need to return to Gaza in order to provide governance and aid. That is the sustainable ceasefire that we will work very hard to bring about.
Nick Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, today I was unsure whether to raise a national issue, such as the desperate need for a Minister for Men, or a local issue, such as Doncaster's need for a new hospital or Edlington for a new leisure centre. But I thought the best thing I could do is ask the Prime Minister to come and have a tour of Doncaster. And while I'm showing him around my hometown, I can press the need for a Minister for Men, I can show him the site for a new hospital, and I can introduce him to the people of Edlington so he can discuss their new leisure centre. So will the Prime Minister accept my my invitation.
Well, thanks to my honourable friend's fantastic campaigning on behalf of his constituents. Doncaster City Council has received, I think, more than £80 million in levelling up funding to support its regeneration products. And most recently, Doncaster has been awarded £20 million in our long-term plan for towns over the next 10 years, which I know he is working very hard to make sure is prioritised for local people. I would be delighted to discuss those projects and his other ideas when I come and visit him as soon as my diary allows.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. 71% of requests for funding from the Community Ownership Fund aimed at saving libraries, pubs and village halls have been rejected since 2021. It pits communities against each other and does nothing to address the underlying causes that have led to the loss of these much-loved assets. When will the government offer more than a simple sticking plaster for our towns, high streets and communities?
Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I set up the Community Ownership Fund when I was Chancellor, and it is doing fantastic work, funding hundreds of projects across the country, including, I believe, one in the Honourable Lady's own constituency, the Back on the Map scheme. It is there to support local communities to take over assets, whether it's pubs, village halls or other community assets, and it's doing a fantastic job. It's right that there's a competitive process because we want to make sure that that money is deployed in the areas where it can make the most difference.
Greg Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Overcrowding on Chiltern railways has become a daily misery for commuters from stations like Haddenham and Tame Parkway and Princes Risborough in my constituency, the root cause of which is an ageing fleet constantly breaking down and shorter trains having to be run. There are proposals on the table for both short-term additional capacity and long-term fleet renewal. So will my honourable friend, the Prime Minister, instruct the Department for Transport to fast-track those proposals so we can end overcrowding on Chiltern?
Prime Minister.
And I agree with my honourable friend that the performance on Chiltern hasn't been good enough in recent times. I know that Chiltern have recently begun engagement with the rolling stock leasing market, which will help reduce overcrowding, but also together with DfT, they're looking at providing additional capacity at peak times. So I know my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, will ensure that these plans continue to progress and keep my honourable friend updated.
Patrick Reddy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What exactly is it about the prospect of deportation to Rwanda that makes the government think it will be such a deterrent to asylum seekers? Does it think that life in Rwanda is somehow less comfortable, less secure, less safe than it is here in the United Kingdom? What does the government think is wrong with Rwanda that means asylum seekers won't want to live there?
Speaker, it's not that there's anything wrong with it, it's just that it's not the United Kingdom, Mr. Speaker. And I have to point out to the honourable gentleman that deterrence works. We know that it works because our scheme with Albania has ensured a 90% reduction in arrivals from that country.
Therese Coffey.
Mr. Speaker, I know my right honourable friend the Prime Minister is committed to energy security and the development of renewables, as am I, and that's why Sizewell C started a DCO this week. However, there are plenty of other developments which are happening on greenfield sites where CPOs are planned to be used by National Grid to plough up farming fields used for food but also tree production as well, when there are brownfield sites already available connected to the network. National Grid is refusing to publish its study of Bradwell and why they deem it would not be suitable for this connection of offshore wind farms and interconnectors. Will he meet with me to discuss this and other East Anglian MPs and also to use the powers of his office to get that study published?
As my honourable friend will know, that planning applications for new infrastructure are managed independently, so I can't comment on specific cases, but I do agree with her that it's important to listen to the views of local communities like those that she represents across Suffolk and East Anglia. I know my honourable friend for Aberdeenshire West was visiting her area recently to mark the commencement of the project at Sizewell C, and I can assure her that relevant ministers will continue to pay close attention to her concerns.
Stevens.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Leader of the House last week correctly described the contaminated blood scandal as on another level compared to other scandals. Now that Sir Brian Langstaff has announced today the publication of the final report of the infected blood inquiry, he reminds us, Mr. Speaker, that his principal recommendation remains that a compensation scheme should be set up with urgency and that no one should be in any doubt about the serious nature of the failings over more than 6 decades that led to catastrophic loss of life and compounded suffering. Prime Minister, over 100 parliamentarians wrote to you this week, so can you tell us now when those affected will be paid compensation for their loss?
Mr. Speaker, I'm acutely aware of the strength of feeling on this issue and indeed the suffering of all of those impacted by this dreadful scandal. I gave evidence to the inquiry last year, and as I said then, I recognise the suffering that thousands have experienced over decades. He will know that the Minister for the Cabinet Office updated Parliament on this towards the end of last year. He'll know it's a highly complex issue. Interim payments have been made in some cases, and we are committed, absolutely committed, to responding to the final report as quickly as possible following its publication.
Robert Neal.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last week, Conservative-controlled Bromley Council's children's services were rated outstanding by Ofsted in all 4 areas of inspection. Only the 3rd time that has happened under the current framework. Will he join me in congratulating the officers and members of Bromley Council and perhaps even visit Bromley and see our new cost-saving civic centre?
Well, perhaps not quite on my way to Doncaster, but I'll bear it in mind. But can I join my honourable friend in paying tribute to Bromley Council and all the officers involved in providing what is an incredibly important service in their local community and looking after some of the most vulnerable children in our society. They all deserve our thanks and our praise for their brilliant efforts.
Dr. Rupert.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. HS2 promised to transform intercity travel and my seat where Old Oak Common will be one day. But after Leeds and Manchester were ditched, it's London ends now in doubt. Could the PM today commit to ensuring it at least reaches Euston, or is he intent on stopping all transport forms, except private jets, maybe?
Prime Minister.
I think her leader might have something to say about the forms of transportation, Mr. Speaker, and perhaps on HS2 as well, because I still haven't actually heard from him his position on the whole subject. But we have, Mr. Speaker, I would say Old Oak Common is destined to be one of the foremost stations in the country because of the station and the extra connectivity that it will have across London as the initial terminus for HS2 trains. And as we said at the announcement, we are working with the private sector, as we have done in other developments in London, to raise private money, save the taxpayer money and deliver the connection to Euston as planned.
Thank
you, Mr. Speaker. I've just got back from the inaugural Women's Health Summit. During the summit, it was announced that the specialist maternal mental health services will now be available to women in every part of England by March. This is particularly pertinent for me after one of my constituents, Jessica Cronshaw, passed away whilst pregnant with her baby Elsie after suffering with severe pregnancy sickness, hyperemesis gravidarum. So can I thank the government for following through with this important reform and push him to keep going with the spirit of this reform so our NHS is fit for women in the future?
Prime Minister.
Well, can I thank my honourable friend for raising this matter, and I know the whole House will want to convey our sympathies to Jessica's family, but I'm pleased that the reforms that we are making will make a difference to women across the country in the future. We're committed to our women's health strategy, and I'm grateful that for her support and, again, her advice and ideas so we can ensure it delivers the care that we want it to across the country.
Andrew Gwynn.
The Conservative candidate for the Wellingborough by-election yesterday revealed that the Conservative Party had offered her a deal to be the candidate if the previous member, her partner, stood down without a fuss. The Prime Minister said just last week that candidate selection is all done locally within his party. So would he now like to deny that this secret deal was offered?
Mr. Speaker, as I said last week, in our party, candidate selection is done locally.
James Gray.
Mr. Speaker, would my right honourable friend the Prime Minister agree with me that a remote rural hotel is just the wrong place to house asylum seekers and refugees from their point of view? And will you therefore join me in thanking the Home Secretary for announcing yesterday that the Wiltshire Hotel outside Rolwyn Bassett is in fact to be returned to its proper purpose in April?
Well, I thank my honourable friend for the question. He's absolutely right. the use of hotels is unfair, and also it's unfair on local communities and also costs taxpayers £8 million a day. And that's why our plans to reduce the number of people coming has meant that we could close the first 50 hotels across the country, with more to follow, and I thank the Home Secretary and his team for their efforts. But fundamentally, the only way to resolve this once and for all is to implement our Rwanda scheme so we can have a working deterrent, and that's how we will stop the boats.
Charlotte Littles.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've been contacted by desperate constituents who have rung every single pharmacy within a 50-mile radius of Warrington and still haven't been able to access their medication for ADHD. This has been going on for months and isn't just a Warrington issue. Pharmacists are calling it the worst shortage ever seen, with only 11% of people able to access their full dose this month. And ADHD UK have called the government's response pathetic. They're right, aren't they?
Yeah.
So I'm very sorry to hear about the situation in the Honourable Lady's constituency, but the Health Secretary obviously heard what she said and is in touch with the relevant drug bodies to make sure we can have the provision of ADHD medicine to all of those who need it.
Tom Hunt.
For around a decade, over 200 of my constituents in the Mill complex in Ipswich have been caught in the cruelest form of limbo. There's deep structural problems with the building and cladding problems. A few years ago, they got about £50 million out of court settlement to make a contribution towards the cladding cost. The freeholder, NAMA, the Irish financial entity set up after the Irish banking crisis, ran away with that money, putting my residents and my constituents back in square one with little to no hope. Will the Prime Minister talk to the Irish tea shop to raise this immoral case and also meet with me to discuss a way forward for my constituents, who I meet with every week?
Prime Minister.
Well, I'm very sorry to hear about my honourable friend's case, but I'll ensure that the government looks into the details and gets back to him in shortest order about how we can support him and his constituents.
Martin Doherty's close question.
Number 10, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have repeatedly expressed my commitment to joint working with the First Minister of Scotland to deliver for the people across the country.
Martin Doherty.
I'm grateful for that answer, Mr. Speaker. While there's rightfully been much attention paid to the Post Office Horizon scandal, there is another shocking example of government and private sector collusion that began under the last Labour administration and continued under the Tories. Mr. Speaker, almost 200,000 mortgage prisoners who borrowed with high street lenders such as Northern Rock have become trapped after the portfolio was sold off to foreign entities like Topaz Finance and Heliodor, who have been creaming off extortionate revisionary standard variable rates essentially since 2008, leaving even those who kept up with payments in danger of having their home repossessed. 200,000 aspirant homeowners have had their dream taken away from. So can the Prime Minister, instead of playing catch-up with like he is doing with the Post Office scandal, meet with me and campaigners to discuss what more can be done for mortgage prisoners?
Mr. Speaker, I am familiar with the situation for mortgage prisoners, and something I worked on as Chancellor, and I know the Treasury and the current Chancellor have been engaging with campaign groups and others to find ways to resolve it. It's not an easy situation to fix overnight, but there are things that are being looked at as we speak.
Douglas Ross.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Scotch Whisky Association published a report looking at the economic impact of the sector, not just in Scotland but across the whole of the UK. Some of the highlights included that in 2022 they generated £7.1 billion in gross value added, £2.1 billion has been invested in capital projects between 2018 and 2022, and 41,000 jobs are supported by the sector in Scotland, including 1 in 9 in my Murray constituency. Does the Prime Minister agree that supporting the Scotch whisky industry in the forthcoming spring budget and beyond is a correct priority for this government?
Well, my honourable friend is a superb ambassador for Murray and for Scotch whisky, and he's right, it's a hugely successful export industry that supports tens of thousands of skilled jobs across Scotland. I won't obviously tread on the Chancellor's toes about future budgets, but I am proud of this government's track record in supporting the industry, having removed US tariffs on Scotch whisky, reduced tariffs and deals with countries like Morocco and Argentina, and also supporting the sector's interest in our FTAs with Australia, New Zealand, and most recently with CPTPP.
Peter Dowd.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has been very keen to take credit for falling inflation in previous months. Will he now take responsibility for today's rise?
Mr. Speaker, inflation was over 11% when I got this job. Inflation today is 4%, Mr. Speaker. In common with the US, France, Germany, all countries have seen a mild tick-up in December. All countries have. But the crucial thing is that inflation has been more than halved, delivered ahead of schedule, and that is having an enormous benefit to families up and down the country. Benefit that would be reversed by his party's plan to saddle them with £28 billion of tax rises.
Mr. Speaker, I'm a keen parkrunner in Warsaw, but I'm also part of the core team of volunteers that recently brought parkrun to Tamworth. So in the 20th anniversary year of parkrun, will the Prime Minister join me in encouraging other towns that don't yet have a parkrun to get one?
Prime Minister.
Well, it's great to hear that my honourable friend is an avid park runner, and I thank him for actually volunteering so that the people of Tamworth can enjoy one too. I completely agree with him. When I had more time, I was a regular at the North Allerton Park Run and the Junior Park Run as well, which I recommend for those with children. It is a fantastic and accessible way to get people moving, and I join him in encouraging everyone to get involved in his local area and beyond.
Daisy Cooper.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. At the last general election, residents in West Hertfordshire were promised a new hospital, but we are still waiting for the green light and having to put up with broken lifts and overly crowded treatment wards. In other parts of the country, there are entire hospital buildings that have had to be closed down, like the one in Stepping Hill in Stockport, because they are structurally unsafe. From broken promises on new hospitals to the backlog of repairs, people are sick and tired of waiting. So can the Prime Minister tell me, by the time of the next general election, how many of the broken hospitals will be fixed, and will my residents be able to point to a single spade in the ground?
Yeah. Well, Mr. Speaker, we're investing record sums to not just deliver 40 new hospitals across the country, but 90 different hospital upgrades. And she'll be familiar with the plans, I hope, at West Hertfordshire Trust to develop a new emergency and specialty care facility at Watford General, including women's and children's services. It will make an enormous difference to residents in the area.
Leave it.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A recent BBC News article raised fears that Blyth could become a ghost town, as we see our shopping centre closed to be replaced by a new higher education facility. Residents are right to be concerned, and I have personally seen decades of Labour neglect and decline in our town. And I really have. But this Conservative government has invested hundreds of millions of pounds to level up my constituency with spades in the ground as I speak here in the House of Commons. Can my right honourable friend assure me that the rebirth of our towns will continue as a key focus of this Conservative government?
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right, and I commend him for being such a strong advocate for Blyth. And nearly half of the recent Towns Fund has been distributed to northern regions in England to level up constituencies like his own. And that is the difference. As he said, after years, if not decades, of neglect under the party opposite, it's this government that is levelling up across our country.
Final question, Iain Mans.
I'm very grateful, Mr. Speaker. In June 2022, to some fanfare, the government announced the approval of £41 million for a package of works for the restoration of the Tyne Bridge, which is the route of the A167, the old A1, and it connects Gateshead with Newcastle city centre, and is instantly recognisable around the world as an emblem of Tyneside. However, the funding is still awaiting sign-off within the Department of Transport, and work cannot progress. So given the scale and the complexity of the work that's required, and the significant additional cost implications if funding doesn't come forward, can we actually have the money, please, to get on with the work so that the bridge will be ready for its centenary celebrations in 2028?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'll ensure that the relevant minister gets back to him with an update on the project, and I'm pleased not just investing in that project in his area, but also following on from the last question, I know his area has received levelling up funding worth £20 million to help transform the visitor economy economy in Gateshead. Yet more example of this government investing to level up across the north and across the country.
That completes Prime Minister's questions. Point of order, Dame Diana Johnson.
Mr Speaker, further to the question asked by the Honourable Member for Glasgow South West and the announcement this morning by Sir Brian Langstaff about the report on the infected blood inquiry now being scheduled for publication in May, the Honourable Member also raised that Sir Brian said very clearly in his comments this morning, my principal recommendation remains that a compensation scheme should be set up with urgency, and he made that recommendation in April 2023. The Prime Minister did not respond to what Sir Brian has said this morning, and I wondered whether, Mr Speaker, you'd had any indication there'll be a statement from the Cabinet Office to set out what they are going to do about complying with the recommendations made by Sir Brian.
Can I just first of all say this is a very important issue, and I do know that the Honourable Lady has certainly campaigned all the way through to ensure that people are recognise the suffering they've had and the tragedies within those families. What I would say is I'm not responsible for the Prime Minister's answer, and I would say is I've been given no notice that a statement is coming. But what I do know, and I can be rest assured, that the Honourable Lady will not stop at the question she's just asked, but she will pursue it through other avenues to ensure that the question she asked is answered somewhere. Right, we now come to presentation of bills. Tim Farron.
Outdoor Education Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday, 21st of June, sir.
Friday the 21st of June. Okay, Tim, thank you. Right, we come to the 10-minute rule motion. I call Caroline Lucas.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to establish the right to breathe clean air, to require the Secretary of State to achieve and maintain clean air in England, to involve the UK Health Security Agency in setting and reviewing pollutants and their limits, to enhance the powers, duties and functions of various agencies and authorities in relation to air pollution, to establish the Citizens' Commission for Clean Air with powers to institute or intervene in legal proceedings, and to require the Secretary of State and the relevant national authorities to apply environmental principles in carrying out their duties under this Act and the Clean Air enactments, and for connected purposes. Madam Deputy Speaker, in 2013, the life of 9-year-old Ella Roberta Adukisi-Deborah was tragically cut short when she suffered a fatal asthma attack. Ella lived close to the heavily congested South Circular in Lewisham, and following an inquest in 2020, she became the first person to have air pollution listed on her death certificate, with the coroner, Philip Barlow, concluding that, and I quote, Ella died of asthma contributed to by exposure to excessive air pollution. Next week would have been Ella's 20th birthday, and I know that all of our thoughts will be with her family at this time. I'd also like to pay tribute to Ella's mum, Rosamond, who's in the public gallery today, for her incredible campaigning on air pollution, and to express my personal thanks to her for allowing this bill to be called Ella's Law in memory of her daughter. It's an honour to be able to present it in the House today. Madam Deputy Speaker, this bill is needed because, simply put, the state of our filthy air is a public health emergency. Air pollution is associated with conditions like asthma, heart disease and cancer, and has been shown to impact our mental health too, leading to an increased risk of schizophrenia, depression and anxiety. Its impacts aren't equally felt, however, with those on low incomes and from black and ethnic minority backgrounds far more likely to live in polluted areas. And it's children's health that's affected most of all, with a study published just last week by the University of Dundee revealing an increase in under-16s admitted to hospital for respiratory problems following periods of high air pollution. A 2019 study by King's College London also showed that living within 50 metres of a busy road can stunt children's lung growth by up to 14%. And for context, it's estimated that in London, 1/3 of the population, around 3 million people, live near to a busy road. It is therefore profoundly shocking, but perhaps not entirely surprising, that the UK has one of the highest rates of asthmatic children across Europe, with 1 in 11 young people living with asthma. It's been calculated that cleaner air could prevent up to 43,000 avoidable deaths in the UK each year, and it could save the public purse billions as well. Estimates of the public cost of air pollution total as much as £20 billion each year, including the impact on social care and on our crumbling NHS. So it could not be more urgent that the government takes action to clean up our air and protects lives both now and in the future. Yet despite their current approach being vastly insufficient, ministers remain bullish in defending their efforts. Indeed, last year the Prime Minister himself told me, and I quote, "We are confident that the measures we're putting in place are not only legally binding, but world-leading in tackling air quality." And he went on to say that the Environment Act provides, and I quote again, "the capability, accountability and ambition needed to make all the effective interventions to drive down air pollution." And yet the reality is that the Environment Act did very little to help deliver clean air, and it is certainly not world-leading. And the environment target that did get made under it to reduce levels of PM2.5 to 10 micrograms per cubic metre falls short of the new WHO guidelines for 5 micrograms per cubic metre, and it could certainly be achieved far earlier than the government's target date of 2040. Indeed, when Professor Frank Kelly from Imperial College London, an advisor to the World Health Organization on health and pollution, recently gave evidence to the Environmental Audit Committee, he said very clearly that, and I quote, "Our studies show that 99.8% of the UK could achieve a figure of 10 micrograms per cubic metre by 2030, and the 0.2% that could not were certain hotspots in London, which again, if you took extra measures, you could probably eliminate as well." Professor Sir Stephen Holgate from the University of Southampton and Special Advisor on Air Quality to the Royal College of Physicians subsequently wrote to the committee to confirm that this change would result in around 20 fewer infant deaths each year. 20 fewer lives lost, 20 families saved from unimaginable heartache. And so with the Mayor of London having already committed to delivering on this more ambitious target, and with such significant benefits, it is incumbent on ministers to explain why the current legal limit remains so unambitious. And they must urgently set out how they're going to meet the new WHO guidelines, which have halved the limit for PM2.5 to 5 micrograms per cubic metre in response to the marked increase in evidence showing how air pollution affects current different aspects of our health. In the words of the Chief Medical Officer, Professor Chris Whitty, we can and should go further, and it is technically possible to do so. So the Clean Air Human Rights Bill, or Ella's Law, would set out an entirely new approach to delivering clean air in England. First, it would enshrine the human right to clean air precisely and explicitly in English law, thereby transforming decision-making by public authorities by requiring them to consider clean air alongside other rights under the Human Rights Act. It will be a step towards incorporating the 2022 resolution adopted by the UN General Assembly, which recognises the human right to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment. It follows a one air approach that encompasses the health and environmental impacts of air pollution and greenhouse gases. And it would set standards based on advice from the Climate Change Committee and on the WHO's new air quality guidelines, and require the Secretary of State to achieve clean air within 5 years, with the possibility of postponement for up to a further 5 years per pollutant, subject to strict conditions. Now, the Environment Agency and the Climate Change Committee would be required to review the pollutants and the limits annually and advise the Secretary of State if they need tightening. The bill also covers air pollution both outdoors and indoors in public spaces and where health and safety standards apply. The tragic death of 2-year-old Awab Ishaq, brought on by extensive mould in his family's flat, shone a spotlight on the significance of indoor air pollution. And whilst I welcome the prompt action which was taken by the Secretary of State for Levelling Up in bringing forward Airweb's law, a law which should now, frankly, also be applied to the private rented sector through the Renters Reform Bill, it is very clear that legislation to address indoor air pollution must extend beyond the home too. Especially since, on average, we spend around 80% of our lives indoors, whether for work or study or leisure. And finally, in order to ensure independent scrutiny and continuous improvement, this bill would establish a Citizens' Commission for Clean Air, which would review annually the Secretary of State's compliance with the provisions of the bill and advise the Secretary of State where improvement is needed. Now, this is a bill which has already undergone significant scrutiny in the other place, after my noble friend and Green Party peer, Baroness Jones of Moulscombe, topped the private members' bill ballot in the previous parliamentary session. It has already been extensively debated, amended and improved, and it received cross-party support, including from Lord Randall of Uxbridge, former Environment Advisor to the Right Honourable Member for Maidenhead when she was Prime Minister, and he said, and I quote, "We have waited too long for proper clean air legislation. I urge the Minister to back this and say that it is a golden opportunity to do something really wonderful. The government could take pride in being part of a world-beating bill." Well, Madam Deputy Speaker, I think he was absolutely right. By taking up Ella's law, the government has a real opportunity to genuinely lead the world in tackling this pressing public health emergency, and I urge them to take it.
Hear, hear.
The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Who will prepare and bring in the bill?
Barry Sherman, Leila Moran, Ian Byrne, Dan Carden, Munira Milson and myself, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Caroline Lucas.
Clean Air Human Rights Bill.
Second reading what day?
Friday the 14th of June.
Friday the 14th of June. Thank you. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill Committee.
No. Order. Sergeant. Order.
Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill.
I remind members that in committee, members should not address the Chair as Deputy Speaker. Please use our names when addressing the Chair. Madam Chair, Chair, Madam Chairman or Mr Chairman are also acceptable. We begin with Amendment 11 to Clause 3, with which it will be convenient to consider other amendments to Clause 3. Clause 3 stand part, amendments to Clause 5, Clause 5 stand part, Clause 6 stand part, amendments to Clause 7, Clause 7 stand part, amendment to Clause 8, Clause 8 stand part, amendments to Clause 9, Clause 9 stand part, Clause 10 stand part, all remaining new clauses, amendments to Clause 1 and Clause 1 stand part as set out in the selection paper. I call Robert Jenrick to move Amendment 11.
Well, thank you, Dame Rosie. And I know that my right honourable friend said he didn't watch box sets, but here we are once again for the next episode of this drama. It's also the most important one of all, because this is likely to be the final opportunity for this House to consider this bill. Does it work? Will we be able to stop the boats? Can we secure our borders? As members on all sides of this House know, I feel passionately that illegal migration is doing untold damage to our country, and we have to make sure that this bill actually does the job. I want to speak to two amendments, but one in particular, and that is the one with respect to Rule 39. And let me say at the outset of this debate that I don't believe that our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights is sustainable. I think that will become clearer and clearer to the British public in the months and the years ahead. But that's not the purpose of my amendment today. It's not the subject of this debate. That's a discussion for another day. What we're discussing here, I'll give way in a moment, but what we're discussing here is whether or not we believe it is appropriate for a foreign judge in an international court to impose a late-night judgment, often without the United Kingdom being able to give its own arguments or to hear the reasons for that judgment, whether we think that really accords with the rule of law, and in particular, relationship to this policy, whether we are willing to see the same thing happen again that did in the summer of 2022, whereby a judge did just that, grounded the flight, prevented the policy, led to months, indeed years of legal action, and tens of thousands of illegal migrants breaking into our country, costing our taxpayers billions of pounds, imperiling lives in the Channel, and perpetuating this challenge for years to come. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm happy to support my right honourable friend's amendment tonight, as I did last night. I'm on the Council of Europe, so I take quite a lot of interest in this. And there is established legal principle that, in fact, the judge was acting ultra vires in 2022, that it was not in his powers to do it. And there is also established legal opinion that our government could actually have ignored it. So how does this relate to his amendment now?
Well, I'll come on to exactly the points that he's making. They're fair and important ones. I think as night follows day, if we don't make changes in this respect, we'll find ourselves in a few months' time in exactly the same position that my right honourable friend, the member for Whittam as Home Secretary, was in the summer of 2022, whereby the Strasbourg Court will issue one, potentially many, Rule 39 interim measures. The decision will fall to a minister, perhaps my right honourable friend, the Minister for Illegal Migration, and other colleagues within government about what to do. The courts will be involved, and we'll find ourselves in a very difficult, indeed intractable situation. It is, as I said before, a bit like pulling the pin out of a grenade, but not being prepared to throw it. Setting this scheme in train without knowing what you would do when this happens. It's entirely foreseeable. Let's find a way through this challenge. I'll give way in a moment. Now, to answer my right honourable friend's question and to think about the legitimate challenge that's made to those like me who make this argument or who raise this issue, you have to go back to the foundation of the court. And many of my colleagues say, well, it was great Conservative and British jurists who were the authors of the European Convention on Human Rights. Why would you want to alter what they created? Well, with respect, that's a misunderstanding of what was done when the convention was founded and the treaty signed. No one signed up to the court being able to make binding injunctions. In fact, quite the opposite. This was considered at the time and was rejected. The UK, like all other signatories to the European Convention, expressly declined to give the court the power to make binding interim measures. This was something that was created by activist judges in 2005 in response to a particular case, which was the Mamat Kulov and Askalov versus Turkey case in 2005, whereby the court conferred upon itself a power which was not given in the treaty. And I think it is a mistake that the United Kingdom has, by convention, gone along with this approach that the court has given itself for many years. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of many other eminent jurists and lawyers. When this very point was considered in the other place during the passage of the Illegal Migration Act, a point not dissimilar to the one that I'm making, but I won't put words into their lordships' mouths, was made by the noble Lord Sandhurst, the noble Lord Fuchs, the noble Lord Wolfe. And in a foreword to an important piece related to this, the noble and learned Lord Sumption has made a similar and very important point. In fact, the Professor of International Law at the University of Oxford, Professor Richard Eakins, that many of us respect highly, has said that to change this approach is not to breach the rule of law, it's to defend the rule of law, because we, as signatories of the European Convention, expressly objected to this approach. And this has been conferred by activist judges outside of the rule of law, and we shouldn't be following through this. I'll give way to the honourable member, because he was first in the queue.
Very grateful to the honourable gentleman, and I will say at least he has the strength in being vocal about what he actually believes, which is a lot more than many on that side. And he's made it clear that, in his view, he could not care less about what European conventions on human rights say. Will he go further and actually openly say that there is one purpose of this vile, dangerous, inhumane bill, which is to flout international law, and that that side couldn't care less about human rights of the most vulnerable individuals?
But I can't say I'm surprised that the honourable gentleman sinks to those depths and doesn't present a proper legal argument in response, because if he'd been listening to me, I didn't say anything of the sort. The case that I'm advancing is far from undermining the European Convention on Human Rights, and there are many who might wish to leave it. We're defending the original intent of the European Convention on Human Rights and the rule of law, because I don't think that it is sustainable for activist judges in Strasbourg to bend and change the original intent of the signatories of that convention in ways that they would never have accepted and invent new powers. I want us to defend the rule of law, and in this case, that is best defended by saying that interim measures from the European Court are not binding on the UK, either on the domestic plane or upon our ministers. And it is better that we return simply to the position that we were in as a country before 2005. In fact, I think most of that was under a Labour government. I'll give way to the honourable member.
I thank the Foreign Minister for giving way. I just wonder, is this British exceptionalism? Is the case that he's making that the ECHR should only no longer apply to the UK, or is he saying that it's not fit for purpose across the board and should be scrapped entirely?
As if we're having a bit of a dialogue over the deaf here, because that's not what I said at all. I said that the debate about the European Convention is for another day. But what he is saying that the decision of the Strasbourg Court in 2005 to confer upon itself, without seeking the consent of any of the signatories of the Convention, that it should be able to impose interim measures, injunctions, upon other countries which are binding, is the right way forwards. And indeed, that those injunctions should be able to be made at the 11th hour, in the middle of the night, without giving reasons, without asking for our own arguments, without even naming which judge was behind that. I think that poses very serious rule of law questions, and is a reason why conventions such as the European Convention are increasingly out of step. I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
My right honourable friend, of course, is right, and that contradicts custom and practice over a very long time indeed. What was the accepted basis for the rule of law in this country? He cites Lord Sumption and Lord Wolfe, but he might have cited A.V. Dicey, who established long ago as a constitutionalist, supported by Lord Denning and many others after, that the relationship between the rule of law in this place is that a polity makes laws because it has the legitimacy to do so, conferred on it by the people, and it can change laws, and that, frankly, means that this House is supreme. That doesn't in any way underestimate the significance of international agreements and treaties, but it does affirm the significance and sovereignty of this House.
I entirely agree with my right honourable friend, and let's move forwards and see what... Well, I'll give way to the Honourable Lady, but then I'll continue my argument.
For giving way, because as somebody who has served on the Council of Europe and was proud to do so because of the United Kingdom's history in setting it up to protect citizens from overbearing governments, I think it is worth to look at the actual data on interim measures. So for the 3 years that we know about, in 2019, there were 82 requests made to the Strasbourg Court for interim measures against this government. 0 were granted. In 2020, 47 made, 2 granted. In 2021, 51 applications against this government, 5 granted. So that's just 7 out of 180. Is he really suggesting that this government gets things right all the time, that there should be no capacity to legally challenge them, even when irrevocable harm is on the agenda?
I'm making, and once again, the Honourable Lady isn't listening. The point I'm making is not about the virtues or otherwise of our membership of the European Convention on Human Rights. I've said that that is a matter for another day. The discussion on this amendment is simply whether or not we believe it is right that the Strasbourg Court should confer upon itself, without our consent, the ability to impose binding injunctions. There's a separate question, not unrelated, as to how those injunctions are made, and I think most of us, I'd like to believe, would agree that doing them late at night with an unnamed judge without giving reasons raises serious rule of law questions. Perhaps the Honourable Lady disagrees with that. But the purpose of this amendment is to enable us to return to a position that, yes, of course, the Honourable Lady has her clip for social media now, so the rest of the debate is largely irrelevant. But I'll give way to the Honourable Lady.
I want to address the point of law about the court in Strasbourg. The difficulty with the argument he's making is this, is it not? That under the scheme of the Convention, the court is the body that determines the meaning of the Convention. And not just in the case, the 2005 case, but consistently thereafter, the court has held that failing to comply with interim measures amounts to a breach of Article 34 of the Convention. Now, that's the legal difficulty with his argument, is it not?
No, it may be a good faith disagreement between the Honourable Lady and I, but I don't believe that international bodies and courts should be able to grow organically as a result of the decisions of activist judges. I think this is a matter of the rule of law and of parliamentary sovereignty. And we in the United Kingdom chose to be signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights. I don't think it's correct that the court gave itself this power in 2005. Now, let me return more directly to how this relates to this policy. So, firstly, let's cast our mind back to the summer of 2022. An interim measure came via a Rule 39 interim measure was imposed by the court. This grounded the flight and prevented us from proceeding with the policy. Do we think that anything has changed in the months and years that have passed? My conjecture is no. We will be in exactly the same position in a few months' time unless we take action. In the Illegal Migration Act, we included a provision which merely restated the orthodox constitutional and legal position that, in theory, it is at the discretion of a minister as to whether or not to comply with a Rule 39 interim measure. Belying that was the government's legal advice that, in its opinion, which I believe to be erroneous for the reasons I've just described, it would be in breach of international law to do so. The Attorney General and the Government Legal Service, therefore, as far as I'm aware, continue to advise ministers and civil servants that a decision not to support a Rule 39 interim measure would be illegal and would be in breach of the Ministerial Code. In fact, my best recollection of that was that no minister should give any indication that they would ignore a Rule 39 interim measure. The Attorney General's position, as I understand it, is that there is a very small number of cases in which it is conceivable that one could do so. But that's a vanishingly slim number of cases and situations. So were that situation to continue, as night follows day, we'll find ourselves in exactly the same situation we were in the summer of 2022. I don't want to be in that position. And I think it would be a huge breach of trust to the British public if we knew something was likely, if we've watched this train speeding down the tracks but moving slowly towards us, we've had ample opportunity to resolve this issue, and we've chosen to do absolutely nothing. We've kicked the can down the road. There's no more road. At the end of the road, there's a precipice. We're moving forward with a scheme, but we don't know how to implement it. We're pulling the pin out of the grenade, but we haven't got the guts to throw it. What we need to do is resolve this. And the way to resolve it seems to me to be quite simple. The government could accept the amendment in my name and that of many, many others. To do so is not to say that we're leaving the European Convention on Human Rights. There are respectable international law arguments behind the amendment. I would wager that the government would have no difficulty finding senior KCs and former judges in the other place who would support my position and its position if it chooses to adopt it. It could change some of the minor documentation that accompanies this, like the Civil Service Code and the Ministerial Code, but I wouldn't place too much emphasis on those. At the end of the day, this isn't about civil servants. This is about ministers, and it's about the law. I think a good captain doesn't blame his sailors. It's on us. We have the power to fix this, and we have the responsibility. So let's use the opportunity we have today with the amendment that we've brought forward to resolve this. Or else, we will be here in 2 months' time. The Strasbourg Court will impose a Rule 39. The government will be scrambling around how to resolve this. And the government will have no one else to blame. I'm here to help the government to ensure this policy works, because I, like everyone, at least on this side of the House, believes passionately that we have to make this policy work and to stop the boats. So I strongly encourage my right honourable friend, and indeed the Prime Minister, to support the amendment in my name and that of many others, and encourage everyone else on all sides of this House who share my determination to fix this problem to do exactly the same.
The question is that Amendment 11 be made. Shadow Minister Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much indeed, Madam Chair. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairship again today. So here we go again. Day 2 of committee stage of the third asylum bill in less than 2 years, and day 643 perhaps of the Rwanda psychodrama that the Conservative Party continues to inflict on our weary and baffled nation. And let's not forget that this whole saga started off as Operation Save Big Dog, Madam Chair. That desperate and thankfully doomed attempt to save the skin of Boris Johnson. But then, for some bizarre reason known only to the benches opposite, it didn't fade away once Mr. Johnson exited stage right. No, quite the opposite took place. Instead, it took a life of its own. It evolved into an article of faith for the Conservative Party, a purity test that has come to define whether or not you're a true believer. And so vast quantities of political capital and untold amounts of government time, resources and energy have been squandered on a policy that at most might possibly one day enable the transfer of a few hundred asylum seekers to Rwanda. It truly is an extraordinary state of affairs, Madam Chair. And meanwhile, out there in the real world, food bills are spiralling, mortgages are going through the roof. There are 7.8 million people on NHS waiting lists. Raw sewage is being pumped into our rivers, and at least 30,000 people risked life and limb to cross the channel on small boats. And nothing in this bill will address any of the challenges that I've just outlined, not even that last one. As I said yesterday, the Rwanda plan is extortionately expensive, with £400 million on its way or committed to the government of Rwanda without a single asylum seeker ever being sent there. And in addition to that vast sum, it will cost at least £169,000 to send each individual asylum seeker to Rwanda, probably far higher than that, but the government is refusing to come clean on that point. It's also unworkable because there is no evidence that sending just a few hundred asylum seekers will deter the tens of thousands who are crossing the Channel each year. Desperate people who have risked life and limb crossing continents to escape from violence and persecution are not going to be deterred by a less than 1% chance of being sent to Rwanda. And, of course, we know the scheme, in addition to being unaffordable and unworkable, is unlawful as found by the Supreme Court due to Rwanda not being, as it stands, a safe country. And yet here we are again, being forced to indulge the fantasies, fixations and psychodramas of the benches opposite. I will be quiet.
That's the narrow legal point. Does he think that it was right for a Strasbourg judge to impose an injunction in the night on his own without giving the British government the chance to make their case? Does he think that was right?
Yeah. Well, what we are seeing is a complete shambolic incompetence in the asylum system, and if cases are not made clearly and are open to legal appeals will come, and in some cases those legal appeals will succeed. On the broader point, the reality is that the United Kingdom is party to a number of international agreements and conventions, and that reality is extremely important to our national interest, and in many cases strengthens our sovereignty and not weakens it. So we on these benches are absolutely clear that politics is about choices, and when you look at the bigger picture in terms of our country's place in the world, it is absolutely clear that our sovereignty and our national interest is strengthened, not weakened, by being party to these international agreements and conventions. But, Madam Chair, I'll just make a little bit of progress and I'll come back. What is also deeply troubling is that every day seems to bring a new example of the tail wagging the dog. Because we now hear the Prime Minister is assembling 150 judges and 1,000 staff to fast-track Rwanda cases through our courts. Sorry, what? Does the Prime Minister know that under his leadership and on his watch, the Crown Court backlog in this country is at a record high of 65,000, victims of serious crime regularly waiting more than 2 years for their day in court so they can seek justice against their perpetrator, completely and utterly broken system due to 14 years of Tory incompetence and indifference. And yet the Prime Minister clicks his fingers and is glibly apparently able to magic up 150 judges and 1,000 staff. Where on earth have these 150 judges been hiding all this time, Madam Chair? Are they going to be new recruits, or are they currently working? And if the latter, are they going to be told to drop everything and transfer themselves to dealing with asylum cases? I trust that the Minister will be able to answer these questions today, Madam Chair, but I'm not holding my breath. But regardless of the operational issues, just imagine the impact the Prime Minister's glib announcement yesterday would have on you if you were the victim of rape, who has been languishing for years in our broken judicial system. Just imagine the anger and the disgust you would feel at the spectacle of a Conservative Prime Minister sacrificing your fight for justice on the altar of his desperate attempt to cling to power by appeasing his backbenchers. What an utterly shameful and shabby way for the Prime Minister of our country to behave, Madam Chair. And I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm very grateful to the Shadow Minister for giving way, and particularly on the point that he raised about choices and political choices in this. He is valiantly opposing this bill, and he voted against it at second reading, just as I did. But does he recognise that, given that this is the last session of this Parliament, that the Parliament Act cannot be engaged, and there's plenty that will take place in the other place? The only way the Safety of Rwanda Bill becomes law is if Labour make the political choice to say that fighting it and frustrating it any longer is not in your interest.
But, well, I thank the honourable member for his comments, but we have made absolutely clear that this bill is unaffordable, unworkable and unlawful, and we on these benches will never support any piece of legislation that is guilty of those three sins. So it is as clear as crystal to us that we will, with pride, we voted against it at second reading. With pride, we voted against the amendments that would just make it even worse. And with pride, we will be voting against this bill at third reading. I will give way.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend, and he absolutely makes the right point with regards to the issue around the purpose of this bill. And let's not forget that there is only one purpose of this bill. And would he agree with me that this is one of the most flagrant attempts we've seen at directly flouting international human rights law, and that's the only purpose of the bill before us today?
I thank my honourable friend for that powerful intervention. It is a bit difficult to determine what the true purpose of the bill is these days, because it has become, I think, embroiled in various Tory internal wars and fights in terms of the factions. It's become embroiled in certain people's leadership ambitions, I think. So it's not that easy to discern what the true purpose of the bill is. But one thing we do know is it will not stop the Tory small boats chaos. That is the chaos that has to be stopped. The people smuggler gangs are trading in human misery. They must be stopped. But we need practical, sensible, pragmatic measures rather than the headline-chasing gimmicks that we have seen from this government over the last years and months. But of course, the irony, I will give way in 1 second, the irony of the announcement yesterday about the judges was, by definition, it's an admission of failure, because it is a recognition of the fact that the bill before us today will fail to prevent the legal challenges and appeals that the judges are going to be working on. So the Prime Minister's announcement yesterday was also further evidence of the profoundly troubling way in which this government is prepared to disregard and disrespect our judiciary. And I would urge members on all benches to take careful note of what Sue Carr, the Lady Chief Justice, told Parliament's Justice Committee yesterday, and I quote, "I'm afraid that this headline draws matters of judicial responsibility into the political arena. Matters of deployment of judges, the allocation of work for judges, and the use of courtrooms is exclusively a matter for the judiciary, and more specifically, a matter for myself and the senior president of the tribunals. It's really important that people understand that clear division. There speaks a true democrat, Madam Chair."
Minister for giving way. The Shadow Minister will know that it is our view on this side that this problem cannot be comprehensively tackled without a deterrent. I can't think of any examples around the world where it's been tackled without a deterrent. I know the Shadow Minister has spoken before about safe and legal routes, and I've asked him questions before about whether he thinks the numbers associated with these safe and legal routes should be capped or whether they should be uncapped. Has the Shadow Minister had thought about what the cap level would be? What would be the number?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his intervention. It's clear that in order to stop the Tory small boats chaos, we have to smash the criminal smuggler gangs. That will be done through enhanced cooperation with European partners and allies. A crucial part of that is, of course, the Shadow Home Secretary and the Leader of the Opposition visited Europol recently. Hugely important that we get better data sharing, cooperation with European authorities, Europol, Frontex, in order to be able to smash the criminal gangs upstream. As I will go on to say in my remarks, the more you jeopardise cooperation with our European partners and allies by threatening to leave the European conventions, the more difficult you make it to have that European cooperation, and therefore you undermine your own ability to deter the criminal smuggler gangs. If you were looking for a definition of counterproductive legislation and policies, this would be the one that you would go for. I'll give way to the gentleman.
Very good point about cooperation. And he's right, the only way you can tackle this problem is by a suite of measures under umbrella policy. But an important part of that, as my honourable friend just described, is deterrent. Because the criminal gangs that he described, Their brand, their marketing message is you'll get to Britain and never leave. And sadly, that's been too often the case, has it not?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman, and as I said yesterday, there are pragmatic, sensible things the government has been doing that we support. The Albania deal, for example, fully supported by ourselves on these benches, and the fact that removals to Albania are facilitated by that deal has acted as a deterrent. It's led to a clear decrease in the number of Albanians trying to come over. Why doesn't the government do more of that? Do the pragmatic, sensible stuff, rather than being sucked into endless bun fights about this Rwanda deal, which is unaffordable, unworkable and unlawful. It's a question of priorities, that's what I would point out to the honourable gentleman. When a government has limited time, resources and energy, focus it on the stuff that works rather than on the headline-chasing gimmicks.
The mantra has been clear for many months from the benches opposite, including himself, about the need for safe and legal routes. So can we have some indication of what the level of safe and illegal routes would be to address the problem? And I put it to him, as soon as that cap is reached, the rest will come by boat unless there is a deterrent.
Well, in terms of safe and legal routes, what I would look at is, as a priority, things like the Afghan scheme, which is completely and utterly broken. We've seen ARAP collapsed, we've seen ACRS never really working. Which is the nationality that is always in the top 3 or 4 nationalities crossing the Channel? It's the Afghans. So I think what we need to do is make sure we get the schemes that are currently in place working properly, and then we need to look at international cooperation, working with our European partners and allies, and creating a dynamic whereby the United Kingdom does its bit as part of ensuring that those who are trying to cross the Channel on small boats do not do so. Okay.
Drawing him back to the actual amendments and to the interim measures of the Strasbourg Court, to build on the question from my right honourable friend, am I right in understanding the Labour Party's position is that it does not want to see reform of Rule 39 interim measures? Because I find that very surprising, given that the UK is working in concert with many, perhaps all signatories of the European Convention on Human Rights to do just that, because most of our friends and allies in Europe consider there to be serious rule of law issues arising from the so-called pyjama injunctions, and we want to see them, like them, reformed. Would the Labour Party abandon that piece of work?
Everything that we do when, as I hope, we enter government will be based on the test. Is it affordable, is it workable, and is it legal? The legal piece has to be based on compliance with our international legal obligations. However, if you cherish something, you also have to be prepared to be open to changing it, to improving it. And it is clear that a global conversation is required about the immigration position in which we find ourselves. A European conversation is required, and absolutely, if we, in concert with our international partners and allies, can find ways of improving the system, then of course we on these benches would be looking to do that. It's unfortunately not a deal that we can negotiate from opposition. It's something that we will certainly be looking to prioritise as and when we come into government. If you don't mind, if the honourable gentleman, I'll make a little bit more progress and I'll come back to him.
Order. Just say, is convention that if a speaker is to be intervened on, the intervenee, if that's the word, would be there from the beginning of the speech? And I know the right honourable gentleman came in a little later than when Stephen Kinnock started his speech. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So it's against the backdrop of chaos, confusion and party before country that we consider the amendments that are before us today, Madam Chair. And I'd like to start by commenting on the amendments in the name of the former Immigration Minister, the Right Honourable Member for Newark. Madam Chair, this bill is riddled with shamefully anti-democratic clauses that undermine the rule of law and seek to undermine the conventions and values that we on these benches hold dear. But perhaps the most egregious example of this is the admission on the face of the bill that its provisions may not comply with the United Kingdom's obligations under international law. And indeed, Clause 3 explicitly disapplies international agreements, including the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 1984 Convention Against Torture. The leader of the more moderate Conservative caucus, the One Nation group, described this approach as authoritarian and a betrayal of who we are as a nation. And he was absolutely right on both points. Our liberal democratic nation is founded on the rule of law and on our respect for the judicial function. Our international standing is founded on our commitment to human rights and international law, and our proud history is founded on the delivery of these principles, including indeed Winston Churchill himself actually helping to establish Britain as a founder of the 1951 Convention. I made the point yesterday, I'll make it again, that it's not for politicians to interfere with court judgments, and it's not for the government to respond in a knee-jerk manner to court rulings that it dislikes. That is the behaviour of an autocracy, not of a democracy. How on earth can our country be the international standard bearer for the rule of law in the face of, for example, Putin's barbarism or an increasingly belligerent China, if we are breaking our own international obligations? Indeed, how can we even hold Rwanda to account on its commitments within this new treaty if we're not practicing what we preach? And then there is the real and present danger that this bill represents in terms of the international agreements that Britain is party to, all of which are central to our national interest.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. Those who are worried about social media may also find it useful to use their phones in the chamber to double-check those international obligations, and indeed the original text of the European Court of Human Rights that says explicitly the high undertaking parties agree to abide by the decision of the court in any case to which they are parties. From the start, it was intended that there was a check and court. I listened to the gentleman opposite. I hope he will accord the same respect and courtesy to me. Does the member agree with me that from the start it was envisaged it was an important check and balance to involve the courts in decision-making?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and I think, as we've also seen in the letter that Nathalie Loiseau has sent to her about the potential risks that there are to the Trade and Cooperation Agreement and a range of other commitments, it is absolutely clear that it is in our national interest to pool our sovereignty with other nations through these conventions in order to strengthen our own national sovereignty, and I agree absolutely with her on that point. But firstly, looking at some of these agreements, the Good Friday Agreement. The European Convention on Human Rights is woven integrally into many different parts of the GFA. The political settlement in Northern Ireland should not be taken for granted. So disapplying the ECHR in British legislation would be playing with fire in that regard, Madam Chair. And of course, the Prime Minister's very own Windsor Framework, which sought to resolve the issues around trade and Northern Ireland post-Brexit, was agreed on the basis of the UK's full commitment to the GFA. I'm sure that the Prime Minister wouldn't want to accidentally set fire to his own carefully crafted negotiations. Then there is the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which includes clauses on important mutual security cooperation, which are reliant on Britain's commitment to the European Convention on Human Rights. Under Articles 1 and 692 of the TCA, UK withdrawal from the ECHR entitles the EU to immediately suspend or terminate the entirety of Section 3 of the TCA. So introducing notwithstanding clauses into this bill would mean that the government would also be dicing with the risk of jeopardising security cooperation with our European partners and allies. And the irony here is that this very security cooperation and data sharing is of pivotal importance when it comes to smashing the criminal gangs that are behind the small boats crossings. So this bill that is designed to stop the potential of, which is designed to potentially deal with the issue of the small boat crossings and the criminal gangs, could potentially undermine the very cooperation which is supposed to be smashing those very gangs. You literally could not make it up, Madam Chair. So I do not believe that legislative belligerence is in the interests or the traditions of the party opposite, and I certainly don't believe it's in the interests or traditions of our own proud nation. And the amendments that have been tabled by the former Immigration Minister, I'm afraid, would simply increase all the risks that I've described, and so we on these benches will be opposing them. Madam Chair, I turn now to the Labour Party's amendments. Again, I stress that we reject this bill in its entirety and that our amendments are designed to limit the damage of this unaffordable, unworkable and unlawful piece of legislation. A major concern of ours is around the way in which the government is handling the entire Rwanda saga from the point of view of transparency, from everything from the costs to the processing capacity of the Rwandan government to ministers trying to hide the fact that criminals will be sent from Rwanda back to the UK, and the fact that the UK may have to take some refugees from Rwanda. Our Amendment 36, New Clause 7 and New Clause 8 are all a part of an attempt to force the government to shed more light on the less clear aspects of the scheme and to introduce more accountability. Amendment 36 would require that the government publish a full impact assessment setting out the costs per person for the removal scheme and the confidential financial memorandum already agreed between the two countries. We believe the cost per person is far higher than the 169,000 already acknowledged by the government, and we want ministers to come clean on that point. New Clause 7 would require the Secretary of State to report to Parliament on a regular basis, as with the Monitoring Committee every 90 days on the operation of the scheme, including data on the number of people relocated to Rwanda and the costs incurred by the UK government. Similarly, New Clause 9 would require regular reporting on the number of asylum seekers declared inadmissible under the Illegal Migration Act from the point of its entry into force, whenever that may be, and the number of such asylum seekers who were subsequently removed to Rwanda. New Clause 8 would impose further reporting requirements on the government, including on the number of individuals involved in criminal activity who have been transferred from Rwanda to the UK. In the event of any such transfers, the government would be required to table a debatable motion in Parliament so that MPs could consider whether, in light of the transfers, the operation of the treaty should be suspended. It is important that the British public understand just how many foreign criminals the Conservative government would be importing back into our country as part of this Rwanda deal. Further amendments relate to the Monitoring Committee, a central part of the new treaty which both sides are required to set up in order to oversee the operation of the removal scheme and to provide a mechanism for individual asylum seekers to lodge confidential complaints directly with the committee. The Supreme Court raised initial concerns about the capacity of the committee to review complaints in its judgment. Our Amendment 59 would make the establishment of this committee a necessary precondition for the commencement of this Act, and New Clause 5 would place the committee on a statutory footing. The Monitoring Committee would be required to report to Parliament every 90 days, confirming that all the relevant obligations set out in the treaty are being fully complied with. In the event the Monitoring Committee either fails to meet the 90-day requirement or reports to Parliament that Rwanda is not in full compliance with any provision of the treaty, this Act would effectively be suspended from being in force until any issues with timing or compliance have been resolved. Linked to this, New Clause 13 stipulates that the operation of this Act should be suspended at any time when the Monitoring Committee is not in operation. Finally, New Clause 5 states that it is for a Minister of the Crown and that Minister only to decide whether or not to comply with any interim measures issued by the ECHR for the purposes of blocking a person's removal to Rwanda. Amendment 38 stipulates that in making such a decision, the Minister in question must consult with the Attorney General. Madam Chair, the Conservative psychodrama of the past 24 hours only goes to serve the old political adage. If a Prime Minister is incapable of managing his own party, he must be utterly incapable of running the country. And the resignation of not one but two deputy chairs last night, followed by a 60-strong rebellion, illustrated the level of utter incompetence at the heart of his administration. Now, you know what they say, losing one deputy chair could be down to misfortune. Losing two in one night is sheer carelessness. But at least we might get to see a bit more of the two of them on their GB News show, discussing days of yore while spoon-feeding each other with cold baked beans, which was my personal television highlight of 2023, and also explains quite a lot about the amount of hot air emanating from the benches opposite. I certainly hope to see and hear more of them in this election year. But in all seriousness, what on earth is going on? The country is looking on baffled that the Prime Minister can pay the Rwandan government £400 million for nothing, yet places such focus on strengthening our security cooperation with Europe to stop the boats in the first place, and has spent so very little time in terms of improving our broken public services or helping our struggling households during a cost of living crisis. They're perplexed that the Conservatives spend so many hours on a piece of legislation that isn't really even supposed to stop the boats. It's about the Prime Minister getting a single plane in the air with a handful of asylum seekers on it so he can say, look, I did it. I delivered the Rwanda plan and removed a few refugees. He thinks that the British people will deliver something to him on that basis. We are perplexed because this is not the behaviour and politics we can afford to expect from a British Prime Minister. These are not the serious policies that will fix our asylum system and make our country a better place. All the headline-chasing gimmicks over hard graft and getting a grip. This is not what the British public voted for. Indeed, nobody, not even the public, his own party, voted for him at all. Madam Chair, this plan is a con. This bill is a sham. I urge all members to get behind Labour's amendments in order to limit the damage, and I urge them to vote against the bill at third reading. It is unworkable, unaffordable and unlawful if we are to stop the Tory small boats chaos and end the expensive asylum use of the hotels which are costing £8 million a day. Then this Conservative psychodrama needs to end. We need Labour's 5-point plan to end this chaos, starting with going after the criminal gangs upstream in a new security partnership with Europol. We need a government that puts country before party, and we need a general election this spring.
It may be helpful if I just clarify a few things. First of all, as well as if colleagues intend to make interventions, it's important that they have been there at the start of the speech. It's also important that they remain to the end of the speech if they have intervened. And I will, don't worry. I also intend to give priority to those who have got amendments down. I will come to others. In addition to the fact that we are discussing amendments, I should explain that because there is clause stand part, the debate can range slightly wider than would be normal, but it is not a third reading debate. There will be a third reading. There is an hour put aside for that, just in case colleagues preferred to speak at that stage. But I know Sir Jeremy Wright has an amendment. So I call
Thank you very much, Dame Rosie. And as you say, I do, in fact, two, and I want to focus my remarks on them. They're amendments 54 and 55. Dame Rosie, of course, we all understand the purpose of this bill is to allow this Parliament to designate Rwanda as a safe country so that people can be returned lawfully to it. But of course, to achieve that, you require a definition of what a safe country is. And the bill does that in clause 1, subclause 5, and particularly 1.5a, which describes a safe country as a country to which persons may be removed from the UK. So far, so good, Dame Rosie. It seems to me that's an essential part of the bill's inherent purpose. But the part of the subclause that concerns me and on which my amendment is focused is what it then goes on to say. So that in fact what 1.5a says is that a safe country is a country to which persons may be removed from the UK, and this is the bit that worries me, in compliance with all of the United Kingdom's obligations under international law that are relevant to the treatment in that country of persons who are removed there. In other words, it seems to me the bill is saying that the United Kingdom can, by means of this legislation, by saying that Rwanda is a safe country, also deem itself to be in compliance with a set of its international law responsibilities. And I don't, Dame Rosie, think that can be correct. Now, there are few in this House, I suspect, as familiar as I am with the vagaries and complexities of international law. But surely if international law means anything, it must mean that it does not lie in the hands of any individual nation state, even this one, to determine its own compliance with international law. And if it were otherwise, international law wouldn't really be international, and it certainly would serve no purpose in containing bad behaviour, as we sometimes ask it to do. I give way.
I'm very well aware, I work very closely with my honourable friend in a number of ways, as he knows. I'm very well aware that my honourable friend is a former Attorney General. And if he were right that it's not for the government or this House to determine whether measures are compliant, why on earth would they seek and get the Attorney General's advice on just that?
My right honourable friend knows that the Attorney General is consulted on a variety of different legal questions, both domestic and international. He wouldn't expect me to disclose any of the advice I have previously given, but I can tell him that the Attorney General does give advice on whether the government's actions may or may not be in compliance with international law. But the Attorney General, and I don't think the government, expects to be the ultimate arbiter of that question. The advice is given as to whether or not it is likely that this action would be in compliance with the law. And I'll come in a moment to what I think the bill and the government can properly do in relation to international law responsibilities, but it does seem to me that what it can't properly do is to set itself up as judge in its own cause on questions of international law. And this House would be wrong to pass a bill that suggested that it could. That's really where my amendments are focused. And as I say, there's a good practical reason why we should be nervous about this, because we do sometimes rely on international law in order to discharge our own policy intents and purposes. And not more than 48 hours ago, in this place, we were doing exactly that. We were saying that it's important to criticise the actions of the Houthis in the Red Sea because they contravene principles of international law. And we were saying too that we justify our own response to that because it is in accordance with the principles of international law. And quite right too. We would not have accepted the Houthis' unilateral declaration that they were in compliance with international law when they did what they did, nor should we have. And we wouldn't, of course, accept a Russian legislative act to say that the invasion of Ukraine by Russia was in compliance with Russia's international law responsibilities. Now, I make it clear, Dame Rosie, I'm not, of course, suggesting that what the government has in mind here is in any way comparable to those two examples. But it does seem to me that the point here is that to arrogate to yourself the right to declare your own compliance with international law runs the risk, first of all, of other states finding comfort in our example, and secondly, of undermining our own messages in other situations. And that, if I will in just a moment, and that in my view makes this not just bad law, but also bad foreign policy. I give way.
Thank the young gentleman for giving way, and I'm very pleased to hear what he has to say on the question of international law. Does he therefore share with me, and I am not as legally qualified as him, I would fully accept that, a concern that the government's own legal advice states that by stating that the bill is incompatible, it makes it compatible. Is that not worthy of the Mad March hare when it comes to consistency and standing up for the rule of law?
I suspect what the Honourable Lady is referring to is the statement of incompatibility at the beginning of the bill with the Convention on Human Rights and with the Human Rights Act. And of course, that provision is there for a reason. It's to allow the government, if it so chooses, to act in defiance of those responsibilities. That is perfectly proper, and I'm going to come on to explain why I think that is something the government can properly do. What I'm concerned about is something a little different, which is instead of saying, we don't think this is in compliance with international law, we're going to do it anyway, instead of that, saying, we think this is in compliance with international law, it's down to us to decide that, and we have so decided. That feels to me as though that is something that we could not and should not do. Now, Dame Rosie, it would be concerning enough, in my judgment, if this bill only tried to deem the UK's compliance with international law, but it also seems to say that we can deem Rwanda's compliance with international law. And that is set out, of course, in clause 1.5b, which goes on to say that for the purposes of this Act, a safe country includes, in particular, a country from which a person removed to that country will not be removed or sent to another country, again, so far so good. That's essential, it seems to me, to do what the bill seeks to achieve. But it goes on to say, in contravention of any international law. And again, it cannot, it seems to me, lie in the hands of this Parliament to decide whether or not a country may be removed to another country in contravention of any international law. And it goes on in B2 to say that, again, a country would be a safe country in which any person who's seeking asylum or who's had an asylum determination will both have their claim determined and be treated in accordance with that country's obligations under international law. So what it seems to me the bill is seeking to do is to say, if we deem it so, not just is the UK in compliance with its international law responsibilities, but Rwanda is going to be as well. And that feels to me not valid and somewhat over-ambitious. I happily give way.
Whether my right honourable friend, who has great experience as former Attorney General, would agree with me that actually the deeming provisions under the Withdrawal Act creates another rather similar situation, because we deemed EU law to be UK law, and therefore, on the analogies he's just given, that he would argue, I imagine, I think he might even have been Attorney General at that time, actually did exactly the same sort of thing, although I am listening with great interest to the very more precise point he's making about this relationship with international obligations, on which I will speak later.
Very grateful to my right honourable friend for his intervention. And I know, Dame Raisey, you would not want me to abuse the privilege that you've given us to range slightly more widely, to range quite that widely, so I won't. But he's right that I'm making a fairly precise point about what this language appears to me to say. And I stress, I don't think, in order to achieve the objectives the government has set in this legislation, with which I have some sympathy, though their methods make me nervous, and I make no bones about that, I do not think it is necessary to include this language. And I think, worse than unnecessary, it presents some dangers, which I don't think we need to present in order to achieve, as I say, the government's objectives. But look, I completely understand, and I suspect my right honourable and learned friend, the Minister, will tell me in a few moments or hours' time that I don't need to worry about any of this, and he may say that that is for two reasons. The first of those is he may say, well, the bill doesn't mean what I think it means. Well, you'll forgive me for saying this, Dame Rosie, but I'm getting increasingly troubled in this place that we answer points such as mine by saying, yeah, but it doesn't really mean that, and we don't really mean that by it. I think we have to be concerned as legislators with what the language we are passing into law actually says, not what we meant it to say. And I am concerned that what this language says is not, I'm sure, in accordance with what my right honourable friend wants to do or the government wants to do, but it might nonetheless have that effect or be taken by others to mean the things that I am concerned about. And so when it says what it thinks a safe country is, this bill, it seems to me it's potentially confusing two different things. One of them is deeming your own compliance with international law, which I don't think any country should be able to do. And the other is saying that Parliament resolves to do something even if it contravenes the UK's international law obligations, which, going back to the previous intervention, I do think the British Parliament can do, and we as a legislature can resolve to do if we so choose. We have to decide, of course, whether that is a wise and sensible thing to do, with all the ramifications it might bring, but as a matter of law, it seems to me that the UK Parliament can, if it wishes, pass a law to say, despite or irrespective of our international law responsibilities, this is nonetheless what we want to do. But that is not the same as deeming your own compliance with international law, which I worry this language almost certainly seems to do. And the point I make about the UK Parliament being able to do things, even when they contravene its international law responsibilities, is of course already in the bill, already reflected in the language of clause 1(4)b, which points out, and I quote, that the validity of an act is unaffected by international law. Well, quite right. So we can, if we so choose, deem a country as a safe country for the purposes of domestic decision-making if we want to. But what I don't think we can or should do is to legislate to say we comply with our international law responsibilities when we do, and crucially, as I say, to achieve the objective of this bill, we do not need to. So the second reason, Dame Rosie, why the Minister may say I do not need to worry myself about all of this is because he may say that domestic and international law exist on different planes, and this legislation is only targeted in any event at domestic authorities, so the bill couldn't, even if it chose to try, deem our compliance with international law in actual fact anyway. And I would agree with that. It is perfectly true that domestic law and international law operate on different planes, and it isn't likely, this bill, to determine any question of international law before any international tribunal. But if that is so, why include the language? If it doesn't have any meaningful legal effect, it doesn't serve any purpose, but what it may do, I fear, is send a damaging political signal to other states. So, Dame Rosie, it seems to me that the language I am concerned about, and which Amendments 54 and 55 would remove, is either offensive or it's otiose. And in either respect, the bill will be better without it.
Joanna Cherry.
Dame Rosie, it's a pleasure to follow the honourable and learned gentleman, and I found myself in agreement with much of what he said, and I think he made his points very forcibly. I rise, Madam Chair, to speak to Amendments 32, 33, 34 and new Clause 4 in my name, and to Amendments 4 and 5 in the name of my honourable friend, the Member for Glasgow North, and also to support those amendments in the name of my honourable friend, the Member for Glasgow Central. I also want to make some comments about the clause stand part in relation to clauses 3 and 5 of the bill, and the amendments that have been put forward, particularly by the Right Honourable Member for Newark, particularly in my capacity as Chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights. But first of all, I want to turn to my amendments, which are about the impact of this bill in Scotland, and in which respect I'm speaking in a personal capacity. My amendments and those of my honourable friend for Glasgow North go to the extent of the bill, its extension to Scotland, and also to the date of its commencement in Scotland. Both of us seek to prevent this bill extending to Scotland, and in the event that we are not successful in doing that, my amendments seek to ensure that the bill will not extend to Scotland without the legislative consent of the Scottish Parliament, and that nothing in it will interfere with the supervisory jurisdiction of the Court of Session or its nobile officium, and I'll explain what that means a bit later. Madam Chair, we mustn't forget that the regime this bill seeks to impose, together with the Illegal Migration Act, is imposed on asylum seekers across the United Kingdom, not just those who arrive in small boats on the Kent coast. The UK government haven't forgotten that, and that's why they want this bill, with its far-reaching and unprecedented ouster clauses, to extend to Scotland. Accordingly, asylum seekers in Scotland looking to our courts for protection will find that the courts in Scotland have been emasculated in the same way as this bill emasculates the courts of England and Wales. Now, as well as having their jurisdiction ousted on certain matters of fact, as was debated yesterday, the Scottish courts will also find themselves unable to apply the Human Rights Act and unable to respect the United Kingdom's obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights and other international treaties. And I believe this constitutes a very serious intrusion on the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts, an unprecedented intrusion on the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts, and a very serious interference with the separation of powers between legislature, executive and judiciary. And I don't think this Parliament should be rubber stamping this bill at all, but particularly not in relation to Scotland. What this bill seeks to do in emasculating the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts in relation to asylum seekers is anathema to the Scottish constitutional tradition. People in Scotland don't want it. They didn't vote for it. In fact, actually, nobody in the UK voted for this because the policy wasn't in the government's manifesto. But you won't find it, in contrast to England and Wales, Madam Chair, you won't find any opinion polls carried out in Scotland which support this bill. Now, as the great Scottish judge, Lord President Cooper, noted in the famous case of McCormick against the Lord Advocate in 1953, and I quote, "The principle of the unlimited sovereignty of Parliament is a distinctively English principle which has no counterpart in Scottish constitutional law. In Scotland, Madam Chair, it is the people who are sovereign, and that does make a difference to our view of how constitutionalism works and our views on the separation of powers. And it is of the essence of the Scottish constitutional tradition that executive power should not be unchecked." And this goes back in our history as far as the Declaration of Arbroath in 1320, when Scottish nobles asserting the sovereignty of the people of Scotland in a letter to the Pope told His Holiness that if the King of Scotland should ever seek to make Scots subject to the King of England again, they would kick him out and seek another king to defend him. So in Scotland, the sovereignty of the people is our guiding principle, not the sovereignty of the monarch, or indeed our own, or indeed this Parliament. So neither our Parliament nor this Parliament is sovereign, it is the people who are sovereign. Now, just turning to the jurisdiction of the Scottish courts, this Parliament, this Union Parliament, exists because of the Treaty of Union. Scotland has always had a separate legal system, and Article 19 of the Treaty of Union between Scotland and England protects that separate legal system, including its inherent supervisory jurisdiction and including the nobile officium of the Court of Session, which is a power that the Court of Session in Scotland has to give remedies where otherwise there would be no remedy. And since the modern advent of devolution by virtue of the Scotland Act, the civil jurisdiction of the Scottish courts, including judicial review, has been a devolved matter and therefore one properly for Scotland's Parliament. So I believe that this bill is a grave intrusion on the civil jurisdiction of the Scottish courts, and that's the reason for my amendments. The Scottish Government is considering a legislative consent motion, and my Amendment 34 would ensure that this bill, when it becomes an act, would not come into force in Scotland without a legislative consent motion. And new clause 4, which I'm putting forward, would ensure that notwithstanding, I like that, a nice notwithstanding clause. I hope honourable members on the other side who've been so excited about notwithstanding clauses will support my Scottish notwithstanding clause. New clause 4 says that notwithstanding anything in this bill, if it were to become an act, the supervisory jurisdiction and the nobile officium of the Court of Session would be preserved. And in that way, I hope to ensure that asylum seekers in Scotland will still have the protection of the courts in accordance with our constitutional tradition. Just to explain, the nobile officium of the Court of Session is a noble office or duty which Scotland's highest court has. It's a sort of extraordinary, equitable jurisdiction by virtue of which the court may, within limits, mitigate the strictness of the law and provide a legal remedy to people where otherwise none would exist. I will give way, yes.
Without prejudice to the content of what she's saying otherwise, could I just simply say in relation to the notwithstanding, I'm extremely glad that the Scottish eagle has landed.
Certainly won't be supporting the other notwithstanding clauses in the bill, but I felt it was perhaps time we had a notwithstanding clause that benefited Scotland for a change. So my amendments, Madam Chair, they're designed to protect Scotland's courts and the Scottish constitutional tradition, and they're there to ensure that asylum seekers in Scotland might still enjoy the protection of the courts from the infringement of their fundamental rights. And that's what people in Scotland want, and that's been expressed repeatedly through the Scottish Parliament. So I am, of course, a Scottish MP and a member of the Scottish Bar, and I'm here to do what I can to protect Scotland and Scotland's legal system for the extraordinary attack which this bill constitutes on human rights and the rule of law. But, Madam Chair, I'm not a Scottish exceptionalist, and I recognise, as reflected in the House of Commons Library's excellent legal briefing on the bill, and indeed in the speech that preceded mine, that concerns about the impact of this bill on the rule of law and the Constitution are shared by many in England and indeed by many lawyers in England. And for every lawyer that has been cited by honourable members on the other side in favour of this bill and in favour of the draconian amendments to this bill, you will find 2 lawyers who disagree. And the library briefing, and it really is an excellent summary of the different legal views on this bill, the library briefing concludes, and I quote, "Tension between the sovereignty of Parliament to legislate and the role of the courts in enforcing the rule of law principle that executive bodies must exercise their powers within their statutory limits may be tempered by restraint on both sides. If either the courts or Parliament cease to exercise such restraint, significant constitutional uncertainty could result. Close quotes. And I believe that if we pass this bill, this Parliament will have ceased to exercise the restraint referred to there. It would be a major departure from such restraint. And I do believe, Madam Chair, that if this bill passes, I believe and I predict that we will see what might be an unprecedented constitutional challenge to an act of the British Parliament. I will give way.
The checks and balances which prevent arbitrary power. And she's right that in our constitutional settlement, that is central. But this is not the exercise of arbitrary power, because the bill and the amendments to it are quite specific about their provisions. So, for example, our separation from the international obligations that I know she holds so dear is very specific in the amendments that are tabled by Honourable Newitt, specific to this particular measure, this legislation. This is not arbitrary, anything but.
What it does do, this bill, is it seeks to carve out a group of people coming to our country or within our country from the protections that the rest of us enjoy. And I think that history shows us that that sort of legislation can put a state on a pretty slippery slope. And that brings me to the arguments I want to make in relation to clause stand part for clause 3 and 5 of this bill. Now, the Joint Committee on Human Rights has not yet had the chance to complete legislative scrutiny of this bill, given the speed with which it has passed through the House. So we have not, as a committee, reached a concluded view on the bill. But before Christmas and before the second reading, a chair's briefing paper referring to the legal advice the committee had received was published, and it's extensively referred to in the excellent legal commentary on the bill published by the House of Commons Library. And it says this, inter alia, that the disapplication of the Human Rights Act in clause 3 of this bill is really very significant. Because, as I indicated a moment ago in my answer to the Right Honourable Gentleman, human rights are meant to offer a fundamental level of protection for every person on the basis of their humanity alone. And as our committee has noted in a previous report, if those protections are disapplied when they cause problems for a policy goal, they lose their fundamental and universal character. And that means that they lose the fundamental and universal character that characterises them. And this is arguably particularly the case when they are disapplied in respect of a particular group. And in this case, fundamental human rights are being disapplied in respect of migrants who come to the United Kingdom without prior permission. Now, bills that disapply parts of the Human Rights Act are not unprecedented under this current government, I'm sad to say. Both the Illegal Migration Act and the Victims and Prisoners Bill sought to disapply Section 3 of the Human Rights Act in respect of certain legislation. However, this bill seeks to disapply Section 6 of the Human Rights Act, and that's the obligation on public authorities to act compatibly with human rights. And that's never before been attempted, even by this government, and it represents a significant inroad into human rights protections. If we pass the bill with that clause there, it means effectively this Parliament is authorising public authorities to breach human rights. Now, that's an awful long way from what this Parliament intended when it passed the Human Rights Act and what the United Kingdom intended when it signed up to the Convention. Now, as we heard at some length yesterday, as a result of parliamentary sovereignty, breaching human rights, if we pass this bill, would be in accordance with our domestic law. But it would still violate the UK's obligations under the Convention, because we cannot unilaterally change what the Convention says. And also, as the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law have noticed in their briefing on the bill, if we disapply the Human Rights Act in the manner proposed, we're also breaching Article 13 of the Convention, which entitles people to an effective remedy. Now, I'm afraid to say that the amendments in the name of the Right Honourable Member for Newark, who's no longer in his place, his amendments to Clause 3 would make the situation even worse. And his amendments 11 to 12 appear to extend the disapplication of the Human Rights Act to anything done under the Illegal Migration Act that relates to the removal of a person to Rwanda. And that could potentially mean that the detention of people awaiting being removed to Rwanda and their treatment prior to their removal would not be protected under the Human Rights Act. Is that what this Parliament really wants to legislate for? And additionally, as the Right Honourable Member for New York seeks to do, he wants to extend the clause to disapplying Section 4 of the Human Rights Act as well. Now, the clause as it presently stands does not disapply Section 4 of the Human Rights Act, and that means that it would, if it remains as it is, be open for a court in future to declare that this bill, when it becomes law, is not compatible with this convention. Now, that would be by way of a declaration only. It wouldn't affect the ongoing function of the bill. It wouldn't mean that removals to Rwanda could be prevented or delayed, but it would mean that this Parliament and government would have to decide whether any changes to the law should be made. And if we amend the bill to disapply Section 4 of the Human Rights Act, again, that's something that has never been done before and something that would further oust the jurisdiction of our courts from saying to the government and the public what their view on the law's compatibility with human rights is. And finally, turning to Clause 5, stand part, I also believe that this bill shouldn't stand part of the bill. We've heard a lot today about honourable members on the other side of the House's concern about interim measures issued by the European Court of Human Rights. And the reality is this: no matter what this legislation ends up saying, it can only affect domestic law. In respect of the ECHR in particular, the UK will remain bound by the Convention as a matter of international law. And indeed, even if this government, God forbid, were to exercise the nuclear option to withdraw us from the Convention, thereby putting us into bed with Russia and Belarus, even if they were to do that, we would remain bound for a further 6 months after withdrawal takes place. And I hope they'll bear that in mind. So Clause 5 at the moment says that only a minister can decide whether to comply with interim measures, and the domestic courts should ignore them. It remains to be seen what a minister would do, but we all know that the Prime Minister has said repeatedly that he wouldn't let a foreign court, to use his words, prevent flights taking off, which indicates that interim measures may be ignored. Now, as I said in my intervention earlier on the Right Honourable Member for Newark, interim measures are made under part of the Court's Rules of Procedure 39. They don't form part of the text of the Convention ratified by the UK, but when we ratified that Convention, we signed up to the idea that the Court, the European Court of Human Rights, is the body that determines the meaning of the Convention, and it's held consistently since the case he mentioned in 2005 that failing to comply with interim measures amounts to a breach of Article 34. Madam Chair, interim measures are fundamental to any court. They are issued to protect the position of an individual while their legal rights are determined. All this fuss about people in their pyjamas in the middle of the night is just very silly. Judges in the United Kingdom, both in the English jurisdiction and the Scottish jurisdiction, are regularly got out of their beds in the middle of the night to issue injunctions in England, interim injunctions in England and interim interdicts in Scotland. It's a standard part of any legal system. And many of the concerns that the other side have expressed about these interim measures have now been addressed by the court in reforms which they are proposing. But any decision of a minister not to comply with the interim measure would therefore be inconsistent with our obligations under the ECHR. This means that Clause 5, if we let it stand part of the bill, will expressly authorise British government ministers to act in breach of international law. That is the reality. And I note that according to the Times newspaper, this is the advice reported to have been given to the government by the Attorney-General and the Minister, the Honourable Member for Mid Dorset and North Pool, when he was Solicitor General. That doesn't surprise me at all. It shouldn't surprise anyone, because any legal undergraduate would be able to tell you that. So insofar as Amendments 23 to 25 state that interim measures are not binding, that is inaccurate as a matter of law. And we must understand that we'll be putting the UK directly in conflict with our international legal obligations. So, Madam Chair, I realise I've taken up a little bit more time than I'd intended, but I hope the amendments I've spoken to and the clause stand part would go some way to ameliorating this bill, but certainly even if they were to be passed, I would be voting against it. Thank you.
Chair of the Justice Select Committee, Sir Robert Neal.
Thank you very much, Dame Rosie. It's a pleasure to follow the Honourable and Learned Lady Member for Edinburgh South West and my right Honourable and Learned friend, the Member for Kenilworth and Southam. Although I won't be supporting the Honourable and Learned Lady's amendments, I have great respect for the intellectual rigour which she brought to Scots law and its application here, and I say the same in relation to the points made by my right honourable and learned friend in relation to his amendments 54 and 55. And I do hope that the Minister will think seriously about how we deal with that issue, and I'm sure he will. But they are serious points which are raised, because in a nutshell, I too would agree with the proposition that whilst of course Parliament can legislate to do whatever it likes in domestic law, simple fact is you cannot legislate away international law obligations or treaty obligations, and it would be misleading to try and pretend otherwise. Can I then turn to the amendments moved by my right honourable friend, the member for Newark? And I'm sorry he's not in his place, because I have to say with every respect that I profoundly differ from his characterisation of pyjama injunctions by a foreign court, which I respectfully would argue is both inaccurate and rather unworthy. Because, as was observed by the Honourable and Learned Lady for Edinburgh South West, it's perfectly normal for interim injunctions to be done at difficult hours when the test for them is met. So we shouldn't say that as being unusual. There are arguments about the way the Rule 39 procedure in the Strasbourg Court works that can be legitimately made, but let's make it on the basis of an accurate construction of what it's about, rather than otherwise. Secondly, it is... let me just finish. Yes, I will actually, and then I'll get on.
Well, Chairman, I have great respect for the argument he makes, and I do defer to his experience and knowledge on this. I'm interested genuinely in his view. He's eliding a judge in the UK issuing an injunction late at night in the event of what would be, in normal circumstances, an individual situation. Does he really think that it's comparable to describe, and that's in the same terms, the act of a court, which is genuinely in another country, a judge who is unknown, anonymous, who does not publish the rationale for their opinion, and in doing so calls a halt, with the support of the government, it must be said, to the policy of the British government enacting a law passed in Parliament? Surely there is a difference, both of degree and of nature, between the two cases.
I think the honourable friend needs to bear in mind, in fact, the application that was made to Strasbourg was an application about the circumstances of an individual case as well. So that's no different. There is a legitimate criticism, one that I've voiced in the past, about the procedure adopted in Strasbourg for these applications in two matters. Firstly, the anonymity of the judge, and secondly, the failure to state reasons. That wouldn't be acceptable from our point of view. But the answer is not then to throw out the whole of the judicial baby and treaty baby with the bathwater in that regard. It is, as is possible, thanks to the Brighton Declaration that was signed by my noble learned friend, Lord Clarke of Nottingham, is possible to actually make reforms following dialogue between member states, the Council of Ministers and the judiciary of the court. And I'm pleased to say that after pressure from the United Kingdom, perfectly properly, the court has itself indicated it is going to consult on reforms to the procedure. And that can only be a good thing. So that's where I think the balanced position is as far as that's concerned. Secondly, of course, I'm happy to give way.
In fact, further than that, there are already proposed reforms that are going to come into place this year to the interim procedure that crucially will remove the anonymity provisions and also allow contracting parties like the UK to make the argument that, as I believe in this case, this is not an imminent risk of irreparable damage. We can fly people back from Rwanda, and that was the argument that we need to keep making.
My right honourable and learned friend is entirely correct, and he and I probably would have very happily argued the UK's case in Strasbourg on those grounds.
Yes.
So let's be realistic then about what we're fighting against. There's been an Aunt Sally with respect set up here, because actually things are already being steps are already being taken to deal with the objectionable matters of Rule 39s, but the principle of them is not of itself objectionable. And secondly, the characterisation of a foreign court is, with respect, not helpful in these circumstances, because it implies something alien. That's not the case in relation either to international law as a concept or to the court itself either. In fact, it happens to meet in a different place in the UK. It's inevitable because it's got to meet somewhere. But it's just bear in mind, not only was the UK one of the driving powers behind the creation of the convention in the first place, behind the court itself, and behind much of the jurisprudence of the court, the UK does actually have a shared ownership of the court, along with all the other member states. And that's demonstrated not just in the treaty, but in practical ways too. For example, the members of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe, members of this House and the other place, have a role in the appointment of the judges of the court. My right honourable friend and member for Gainsborough and I served at one time on the subcommittee of the Assembly that dealt with that process. And I think we did so diligently. So there is an involvement in that process. A British judge always sits on the court, is a member of the court. Judge Tim Ike, the current judge, is a very distinguished international lawyer as well. We're very lucky to have him. Two of the recent registrars of the court, who run the administration of the court, have been British lawyers. British lawyers appear regularly in cases before the court. This is not an alien body. It's a court of which we have joint ownership. It's our court along with that of all the other member states of the Convention. And it's wrong to mischaracterise it as being that there's something which is therefore alien. Certainly, in all international matters, as my right honourable and learned friend said, it operates on a different plane. But the sort of the tone of a sort of alienness is, with respect, both inaccurate and somewhat offensive, and also unnecessary for the purposes of this bill anyway. Because that's the other point that I want to come to in relation to Rule 39. The amendments moved by my right honourable friend and member for Newark are OTOs. They're unnecessary, and frankly they make what is a difficult situation worse. Because as a matter of law, an interim measure under Rule 39 is an indication that is made to the government of the member state. It is not made to the courts of the member state. It's conveyed to the government of the member state concerned. And therefore it is for the members of the government of the member state, i.e. the ministers, to decide what to do about it. I personally take the view that you should be very loath indeed to ignore the findings of the court on an interim matter, and it does run the risk, as the right honourable learned lady rightly says, of placing you in breach of your international law obligation in that regard. But the truth is, it is a political decision which the ministers can take. So what the current, let me just finish this point. What the current bill, in its current formulation, states is actually no more than a statement of the law as it stands, and you probably don't need that clause in the bill. I'm not going to die in a ditch over that, because it's simply stating what is the law already. But equally, there's absolutely no need for the right honourable member for New York's amendment, if you like, to put bells and whistles on OTOs, if I can put it that way. I'll give way to the right honourable member.
I'm loath to interrupt him as he's describing not so much the separation of powers, the desiccation of power, but on a specific point that he made about his reticence or reluctance not to abide by the advice from the court, and he said ministers could do that, but he wouldn't. Would he on that basis not have done what the noble Lord Cameron did as Prime Minister and resist the overtures from the court to give prisoners votes?
In fact, 2 points I make around that. I supported the noble Lord Cameron in that regard because it was a political decision there, and it's worth just looking in terms of the practical politics. Although we were for a period of time at variance with the court in that regard, no harm was done to the polity of the United Kingdom in that regard. No harm was done to the interests of the United Kingdom. No terrible international consequence flowed against us from it. I think the court got it wrong on that occasion, and one of the problems is that there isn't an appeal system within the Strasbourg court, so you have to wait until some future decision may go in a different way. And I think many of us take the view that in reality, the court as currently constituted in Strasbourg, perhaps less activist, if I might say, than its predecessors, might well have found differently in the prisoner voting case anyway. But the fact was, UK ministers took a decision and they did what was right in the UK. It was supported on all sides of the House, and no harm was done. So the idea that there is some terrible consequence will flow to the UK because of the existence of the ability to seek Rule 39 interim measures is just misplaced. Yeah, I will.
Doesn't my friend reflect upon the fact that on this particular question of prisoner voting, which I did discuss with the noble Lord Cameron when he was Prime Minister at the time, that actually it was regarded by the Right Honourable Noble Lord, the Lord Clerk of Nottingham, I think it is, that it was, as he put it, that it was a particular political policy. I think those are the words he used. How would you describe the issue of illegal migration? Would you not regard that, if I may say, my honourable friend, as also a particular but very important political policy?
And that's why, as it happens, I will not vote against this bill, because although I have some misgivings, there is a legitimate concern that needs to be dealt with in relation to illegal votes. But the simple fact is that is not a reason for the blanket derogation, the blanket removal of ECHR protections that are proposed in the series of amendments. That's the difference in IRA 1, that sometimes there's a mixture of politics as well as law that arise in these matters. And I don't, but the point I make is that, frankly, if any government wants to take the political risk of ignoring an interim measure, it can, under our law as it stands. It happens that it actually did effectively in relation to prisoner voting, so it could now if it wanted to. I'm not going to advise on that, because I think one's got to be very wary not to come to views that aren't very often going to be fact-specific when individual decisions are made. That's why it's...
Give way.
Yeah.
I'm very grateful to our friend for giving way, and I don't want to prolong the discussion about prisoner voting, but rather like our right honourable friend for Stone, I remember having conversations about this subject inside government. I think it would be fairer, would it not, to describe the situation that the UK didn't at any point refuse to comply with the judgment. Yeah. It is perhaps a more Augustinian approach to compliance that we've adopted. We just haven't quite got around to it yet.
I think that's right. As I recall it, the UK government put a motion before this House, which the House rejected. So you could have had a perfectly legitimate legal argument that we had taken steps to comply, and Parliament, as it was entitled to, had done otherwise. And that's why the whole of this argument with my right honourable friends for Newark's amendments is that Aunt Sally is really a complete red herring to the real issues that we are concerned with, and why these amendments add nothing to the bill, and I urge honourable members on both sides of the House to reject them. The final thing that I just wanted to deal with, Dame Rosie, if I may, was this. I had misgivings about this bill, and I mentioned that, I spoke about that at second reading. I said that it stayed acceptable, just, and I will continue to maintain that position. My right honourable friend and member for Newark quoted the noble Lord Sandhurst, very distinguished lawyer in the other place, a personal friend of mine, I should say. I ought to say Lord Sandhurst, noble Lord Sandhurst, is chair of the research committee of the Society of Conservative Lawyers. I happen to chair the executive committee of the Society. Lord Sandhurst and Harry Gillow, a fellow member of the Society, published a very useful pamphlet around the impact of this bill, and they updated it in the light of the amendments. And their conclusion, with respect, was this: the bill goes as far as is reasonably possible without risking collapse of the Rwanda scheme as a whole. End quotes. They go on to say, and I quote, the bill as drafted represents the best chance of success for the Migration and Economic Development Partnership with Rwanda scheme. End quotes. So they actually are on the same side of the argument I am, that the amendments proposed by the Right Honourable Member for Newark take it over the line of being able to deliver the economic migration, the Migration and Economic Development Partnership scheme. They risk collapsing the whole scheme. It was ironic that my right honourable friend, the member for you, talked about blowing up the bill. The truth is, his amendments will blow up the deal with Rwanda, because Rwanda has made it abundantly clear that anything that clearly breaches international law will be unacceptable to them, and they would withdraw from the amendment. So not only are the amendments proposed legally unsound and OTOs, they're actually ridiculously bad politics with respect as well, because they would actually defeat the object of those who do want to see people being moved to Rwanda to deter the boats. So on both legal and political grounds, I urge the House to reject these amendments and leave things as they stand.
Gavin Robinson.
Rosie, thank you very much indeed for calling me in this committee stage, and it is a pleasure to follow the honourable learned gentleman, the chair of the Justice Committee, and he did say that at times you will see a collision between, or an interface with, politics and the law. And I hope what arises from my contribution is that there's a third element to that as well, and that's principle. And throughout the passage of this bill, and indeed some of the precursors to it, we have advanced a number of principled positions, one of which challenges the basis of the legal aspiration contained within the bill. Another will rightly challenge that it doesn't matter how hard you suggest this is the most robust piece of legislation. If it doesn't do what it's intended to do, it isn't going to work. And that is an unprincipled place to be with the British electorate. To suggest that all these steps are in earnest and have some virtue, knowing that they are inconsistent and will not work. I made those points during the Nationality and Borders Bill, and the ministerial bench at that time told me I was entirely wrong, and that there was no need to strengthen the provisions, and that the bill would do what they said it would do. And now I hear, through stages of this bill, at this committee stage, the very same people who occupied the front bench adopting the same arguments that we deployed to the Nationality and Borders Bill. I still find it thoroughly inconsistent that our government have reached a position that they have an agreement with Rwanda that involves our country accepting refugees from Rwanda, a country capable of producing refugees, and yet we are considering that in the context of the Safety of Rwanda Bill. It is incongruous to me how a country deemed safe by this Parliament is capable of producing refugees from that very same country. And I haven't heard a robust argument to the contrary as to how that is not an inconsistent position. Of course,
I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving me a chance to put him right, because the example is, for example, the transit mechanism that is in place, where Rwanda is already hosting refugees from Libya, for example. Rwanda, in its generosity and safety, hosting hundreds of thousands of refugees. That's how.
Rosie, and if the Minister is prepared to say that the only refugees that can come to the United Kingdom from Rwanda are those that have been produced as refugees from other countries, that is an absolutely fair point to make. But I don't think that's the point he's making. I don't think it is, and I'm very happy to let him intervene again, but I just genuinely don't think that is the point he's making. And the point I am making, that is entirely inconsistent. On one hand, to say we'll accept refugees from a country, and on the other, deem that country as safe, but I accept our right to do it. And I don't quibble with the government's aspiration that Rwanda is a safe country. I don't quibble with it. I just say there's a complete juxtaposition between, on one hand, saying it's safe, and on the other, accepting refugees from that very same country. And I make the point, Dame Rosie, and I recognise the nature of this committee stage, but I do make the point again to the Shadow Minister. It's not about his valiant opposition at committee stage or at third reading or what passed at second reading. It's about the Labour Party's opposition, which will fold, I have no doubt, fold on this bill in the other place. The political choice will be the Labour Party's. There is no second session or additional session of this Parliament. There will be no Parliament Act available to pass the Rwanda bill, and it's going to be tortured in the other place. The bill will be tortured in another place. And the only reason, or the only way it will emerge or emanate from this Parliament is if a political calculation is made by the Labour Party that there's too much political cost in opposition to the bill, and they draw stumps and allow it to pass. And I reiterate that point. I'm saying it very clearly now, and I suspect in a number of months' time, this point that is being ignored today will become quite acute within our political discourse.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way, and I apologise then. I perhaps hadn't fully understood his point in his question to me when I was making my remarks. It was specifically about the other place. What I would say to him is that Labour members of the other place will give this bill the scrutiny that it deserves, will hold the government to account. And if you take, for example, the illegal migration bill, which ended up going through, got royal assent, in spite of very severe and serious reservations, but we, of course, in the other place, recognise that we have the duty to scrutinise, but also we are responsible for ensuring the proper functioning of Parliament across the board. So I would say to him that I don't think this bill will be treated in any way differently to any other piece of legislation that would go to the other place, at least from the point of view of my colleagues there.
Tim Rose, I'm very grateful to accept that intervention, and the Shadow Minister has made his point and I have made my point, but I suspect that that point you will find as much safety in the point that has just been made as those that stand bullishly and say this is the strongest, most robust piece of legislation ever, irrespective of whether it works. I just make that and put it on the record. Madam Deputy Speaker, as you will be aware from second reading considerations, we do have concerns about the operability of this bill in light of the UK's withdrawal from the European Union and the legislative framework that surrounds that relationship. And that's why you'll see in new clause 3, to speak directly to our amendment, you will see a notwithstanding clause, and I know they've had some humour around notwithstanding clauses from the honourable lady from Edinburgh South, or Edinburgh South West. But that notwithstanding clause is there because we are concerned, in contradiction of government's position, that the claims that have been made in this House and the position that the government have deployed is not sustainable legally. And this amendment proposed by us, the notwithstanding Section 7A of the withdrawal agreement, the European Union withdrawal agreement 2018 amended 2020, is important from a principle perspective as a unionist, from a practical perspective, as a member of this Parliament who believes that our immigration policy applies equally across the United Kingdom. It always has applied equally across the United Kingdom. And the concern is that government is blindly ignoring our concerns and allowing a situation to develop that will cause a fracture in the immigration policy which up until this point has applied equally across the United Kingdom. Now, I have engaged with the Minister on this, and I'm very grateful not only for him making the time available, but the courtesy with which he always approaches these issues. Colleagues will recall that we raised this issue in second reading, and the Minister gave a commitment, and fundamentally the commitment that the Minister gave comes in two parts. One, that government has never accepted that the rights chapter of the Belfast Agreement engages immigration policy. And furthermore, the government have in the past robustly defended the position that the rights chapter of the Belfast Agreement does not engage immigration policy, and have won. They have advanced that argument in court and have won. And that argument that the government is putting forward is predicated on Article 2 of the withdrawal agreement, that there be no diminution of rights for the people of Northern Ireland whenever the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. And as a consequence, given the rights chapter, they say does not apply to immigration, there is no diminution of rights, so this is not captured by Article 2. Now, we engage with the government, and I'm not going to take an intervention at this stage because there's a few elements to this that I want to get out clearly and cleanly, and then I'm happy to take an intervention once I have done so. But the Minister put forward his point. We exchanged positions at second reading about the potential of an updated legal note, and I have to say that, in all candour, the Minister has been forthcoming, government have been forthcoming with addressing this point to us more formally. On Article 2 of the European Union Withdrawal Act alone, not Article 7 of the European Union Withdrawal Act. And, Dame Rosie, let's just be clear about this. We as a national parliament are considering on a national basis our national immigration policy. And our amendment is intended to elicit the government, eyes wide open, choose to ignore us at this point, choose to dismiss the concerns that have been raised, and ultimately leave it to the courts to decide and for the judiciary to determine if there's a cause for concern or not, or take the very simple step on immigration grounds alone to disapply Article 7A, Section 7A of the withdrawal agreement. That's the choice. I shared with the Minister yesterday, and I share with the House today, that there was a High Court case in Belfast. It was a judicial review in the matter of an application for Amam and Jasson. And it's interesting reading, and I share it with the House at committee stage this afternoon. Paragraph 94 of that judgment says very clearly the combined effect of Section 7A of the EU Withdrawal Act 2018 and Article 2 of the Protocol limits the effects of Section 5, 4 and 5 of the European Union Withdrawal Act, Schedule 1 and Paragraph 3 of the same Act, which restrict the use to which the Charter of Fundamental Rights and the EU general principles may be relied upon after the EU's exit. This means that the Charter of the Fundamental Rights remains enforceable in Northern Ireland and falls within the ambit of Article 2.1 of the Protocol. And contained within the Charter of Fundamental Rights is Article 18, the right to asylum. So everything we've seen from government has engaged the discussion around the rights chapter of the Belfast Agreement. It has not engaged the consideration that was resolved and shared in paragraph 94 of this Belfast High Court judgment, which has a completely separate legal construction as to how the government's ambition around this Rwanda Bill will not apply to Northern Ireland. Now, the Minister said clearly on the floor of the House the bill will apply in full in Northern Ireland in the same way as it does in the rest of the United Kingdom. New Clause 3 is our attempt on the first stage for the government to accept it and rule out the concerns that have been raised, and if they should not do so, then articulate at least their intention, their position, what they believe to be the case, why they believe this interpretation and the judgment from Belfast is wrong. And I raise these issues on a number of levels, Madam Deputy Speaker. As a parliamentary spokesperson on home affairs and somebody who's engaged on these immigration issues for a while, as somebody who's voted against previous attempts because I don't believe that they are the right approach, somebody who has voted against this bill at second reading because I still don't believe it is the right approach, but a representative for Belfast, which, believe it or not, and I say this with no alarm or no theatrics, but as a matter of record, that the House of Commons library figures in September pointed that Belfast has the second highest number of asylum seekers housed within our city across the entire United Kingdom. 78 per every 10,000 within the city's population. And so I'm not being alarmist about that. I'm not going to over-egg it. I'm just making the point that these are important issues, that the unity of our immigration system is an important issue. The protection of our borders is an important issue on immigration terms, and heavens knows we've had enough difficulty around the creation of a trade border in the Irish Sea that we are having to deal with, that we cannot casually or mistakenly or through misplaced hope walk ourselves into the creation of an immigration sea border in the Irish Sea because government fails to accept the strength of feeling on this issue, the cause for concern surrounding it, the legal and judicial opinion that has been given that leans into it,